Welcome back to the All About Pigeons podcast. This compilation is a little different. Most of the time, we talk about the core parts of the hobby, the things that most people think about when they think about pigeons. Racing, showing, rolling, high flying. But all along the way, there have been conversations and episodes that don't really fit into one of these categories. And honestly, some of these are very interesting. So, in this compilation, I pulled together a handful of those episodes. We're going to hear about birds of prey, the story of Cher Ami, the war pigeon, a deep dive into color genetics, a conversation with pigeon documentary maker Jim Jenner, and a discussion with a professor about pigeon lung. Now, even though these topics are all over the place, a lot of what you're going to hear still connects back to what you're doing, no matter what part of the hobby you're in. Because that is what makes this hobby so unique. It's not just racing, showing, rolling, high flying. It's all things pigeons. And that is what this compilation is all about. So sit back, enjoy some of the most unique and unexpected conversations from the All About Pigeons podcast.
Today we have with us Professor David M. Bird. David M. Bird has a bachelor's in science with honors in zoology from the University of Guelph. He has a master in science with wildlife biology from McGill University and a PhD in wildlife biology from McGill University. Emeritus Professor of Wildlife Biology at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. He's co-authored over 200 peer-reviewed papers, supervised 50 graduate students, mostly on birds of prey, and has written and or edited more than a dozen nature books. David is the past president of the Raptor Research Foundation and the Society of Canadian Ornithologists. He has earned several awards for his research and education efforts. Besides his innumerable public lectures and radio and television appearances, he contributes regularly to BWD and Canadian Wildlife Magazine. And today we're going to be talking about birds of prey and their relationships with pigeons and all the stuff that's involved there. So thanks for coming on to talk today, David.
My great pleasure, Philip.
Like with pigeons, there are different breeds of birds of prey, and people will see different ones based on their location geographically. Would it be correct to say that they migrate and everybody gets a little bit of each one, or is there just certain birds of prey in certain areas?
Yeah, it's the latter actually, because I mean, if you look at a field guide showing all the different birds of prey and go anywhere in North America, then I know there's pigeon fanciers all over the world for that matter. In North America, which I know best, there's the basic birds like peregrine falcons, for example, and merlins and kestrels are the most common three falcons that you might find anywhere south of the tree line. And then for hawks, you've got the two different kinds. You've got the soaring hawks like red-tailed hawks and red-shouldered hawks, broad-winged hawks, and so on. And then you've got the accipiter hawks, which are the true forest hawks, and those are the northern goshawk, which is the biggest. And then you've got the Cooper's hawk, and then you've got the sharpshin hawk. And in each of those three species, well, all birds of prey, the females are bigger than the males, sometimes by as much as the third. But what's interesting about the goshawks, Cooper's hawks, and sharpshin hawks is that the female northern goshawk is the biggest, and then you get down to a male, which is smaller, and then you get into a female Cooper's hawk, and there's some overlap in size between those two birds. And then down to the much smaller sharpshin hawk, and the whole thing is designed so that those birds don't compete with each other by taking the same prey. It's also safe to say that there's no way that a sharpshin hawk is likely going to tackle a full-grown pigeon. It's not impossible if the pigeon is somehow impaired in some way, but more than likely it's going to be the Cooper's hawk that's going to take pigeons. Because goshawks, for example, really don't. I mean, other than cities like Hamburg, Germany, and so on, where there's an actual urban population in North America, you'll not find goshawks too often in city environments. But Cooper's hawks, absolutely, they are the velociraptors of the birds of prey.
So that's interesting. You hear a lot of talk, especially in the cities, where these are supposed to be migratory birds, and a lot of guys are saying that they're not migrating because they have a food source in that area, so they'll just stick around, and then that's that. Can you explain like some of the hunting patterns, behaviors of the birds of prey that are in the city areas?
The two main ones that I think pigeon fanciers have to worry about are peregrine falcons and probably Cooper's hawks. I don't think that American kestrels and merlins are going to be too worrisome for full-grown pigeons. Peregrines and Cooper's hawks hunt in two totally different ways. The peregrine, they're both bird eaters, The peregrines are most likely to basically fly around at quite a height, and then they look for prey below. Could be a pigeon trying to return to the loft or whatever. And then they'll often dive out of the sun, just like fighter pilots did in World War II and other wars, so that they can't be seen, and basically strike the pigeon or whatever prey bird it's going after. Some say that there's a lot of debate among falconers and raptor lovers about exactly what transpires when a peregrine falcon hits a pigeon. Sometimes at speeds of over 300 kilometers an hour. Whether it's some have suggested it's the breastplate of the peregrine. I don't buy that. I think it's more likely the halix, the hind talon of the foot, nails that pigeon so strongly that it's probably dead before it hits the ground. Cooper's hawk, on the other hand, is more of a, as I said, velociraptor, and they're very smart in their hunting techniques. And they'll sometimes even land on the opposite side of a roof where there's a bunch of pigeons roosting, and then they'll basically sort of waddle over and turn around the edge and then come whipping around in a hell of a hurry and send the pigeons scattered into flight, and then pick one that can catch the easiest, usually the one that's either the slowest or dim-witted or whatever. The way they're shaped, they have short rounded wings and long tails, as opposed to the peregrines, which have long pointed wings. Basically, those short rounded wings and long tails allow them to sprint over short distances very fast, and so they can often overtake something like a pigeon if it's a short distance. But once the pigeon gets going, then it's hard for a Cooper's hawk to catch it.
Definitely some amazing predators.
Oh no, they definitely are. They've actually amazed human beings for several thousand years, and that's why humans have been engaging in the practice of falconry.
What can someone do as far as modifying their loft or their enclosure to make it less appealing for birds of prey, or maybe even just safer for their own pigeons?
Well, I'd like to start off answering that question by just saying that even though I absolutely love birds of prey, I've studied them for over 45 years. At one point in my life, and this is not a boast, but I was probably among the top 10 guys in the world studying them. I also have liked pigeons. I had a couple when I was young at university level that I stayed in my apartment with me, Oublio and Arrow, I called them. They weren't fancy ones like tumblers or tipplers and so on, but they were just feral pigeons that I had found. And I've always, had an admiration for them. I love looking at the colors, the different colors of pigeons. My favorite ones are the reddish ones. Anyway, all this to say that I've also defended pigeons many times. We both know that there are people that refer to them as rats with wings. Doesn't matter whether they're your tame fancy flying pigeons or a pigeon in the street or whatever. And I've always disagreed with that label, and I've defended pigeons many times in articles. But on the other hand, if someone's trying to feed birds in their backyard and they do it rather sloppily and attract pigeons to the backyard, that makes me nervous, because town councilors and neighbors and so on do not have a good appreciation for pigeons, and then they'll pass bylaws outlawing bird feeding. So that's kind of where I stand with the pigeons. I fully appreciate what you guys do with them, with the breeding of them and the flying of them and so on. But in terms of, I'm trying to think if I was into that and keeping a loft of either, racing pigeons that could make me a lot of money in races, or just the tumblers and so on. The first thing I would probably do is make sure that my loft had some sort of a cover on the top. In other words, you see things in the movies where someone's got a pigeon loft on the top of a skyscraper or whatever, and it's just nothing but a big open cage, made out of lumber with maybe a little bit more sturdy than chicken wire. But I would definitely make sure that if a raptor was flying over, like a peregrine or even a Cooper's hawk flying low over the buildings, I would make sure they couldn't easily see a loft with a bunch of prey in it, because they're going to clock that and they're going to say, there's a food source. I'll come back another time and see if I can nail one of those. That's the first thing I would do. I don't know the exact designs that pigeon fanciers are using these days, but certainly when you let your birds go out to do their flights or whatever, having a very easy way for them to come into the loft, a well-lit loft, so they can see their way if they're being chased by a hawk or whatever. I mean, a Cooper's hawk, is different from a peregrine. A peregrine's not going to go zipping right into the loft after a pigeon, but a Cooper's hawk might. There's a very famous story, Philip, in a book on pioneer days when a Cooper's hawk chased after a chicken on a farmyard, and it actually flew up under ran up under the skirts of a pioneer woman to get that chicken. It's a very famous but true anecdote. I've used it in articles myself. So that's how determined they can be. They will actually run down prey birds into thick bushes, and they're very good at compressing their feathers. They can go through the smallest of holes. You can go on YouTube and watch goshawks and Cooper's hawks. You can watch them being trained to fly through holes in plexiglass, where they show slow motion how the bird compresses its feathers, and all in one motion goes right through that hole. And so you need to have certainly a way for the pigeons to get into their loft in a heck of a hurry. Not necessarily going to stop a Cooper's hawk, but probably it's not likely that you're going to find Cooper's hawks going in the tops of skyscrapers in any case.
Yeah, that's interesting you said that, because I've seen bobs where the pigeons can trap in and the bobs drop down so they can't come back out.
Okay.
And so in some ways I'd be like, well, maybe that would be the doorway, right? Where the pigeon knows how to use it, but the bird of prey
Yes.
can't. But there has been I've seen people post pictures where it's like, yeah, the BOP went through the bobs and then got inside and caused a lot of headaches.
Oh, yeah.
So you're also talking about covering it. So even like the aviary. So if you got a loft and then you have an aviary, it's probably a good idea just to put a cover over that too. So if something is flying overhead, it doesn't look down there and see a big food source.
That makes perfectly good sense to me. I would certainly do that. Could be a tarp, could be just a solid roof on it, or it could be maybe you could get something like old Christmas trees or Christmas tree boughs or whatever, and lash them onto the top if you wanted something looking a little anything that breaks up the obvious vision of a bunch of pigeons sitting in a cage waiting to be nailed by a predator that can get in there.
So what other visual deterrents, right? There's so much stuff you see online, reflective tape, fake owls, those streamers, spinning reflectors.
Mm-hmm.
Are any of those right there useful to kind of deter away, or is there something better?
What I did when you presented me with some questions is I went to 3 different places to find out how they deter birds of prey. One of them is airports, because birds of prey can sometimes get sucked into jet engines, and they do visit airports because there are prey there, ducks and gulls and so on. And also people who feed birds in the backyard. I'm one of them. How do we deter hawks from coming in the backyard? And the third one is, if I've got a poultry flock, how do I keep birds of prey from coming into, say I'll get free ranging chickens and then there's no roof over the cage. How do I keep the hawks from coming in? So I went to all 3 of those different places to look and see what those groups of people were doing. It's not an easy thing. I can tell you right now that putting up those CDs and reflective tape and so on, they might work temporarily or maybe on a bright sunny day. The idea behind them, for example, is that birds of prey and crows, for example, and ravens have been shot at and persecuted for decades, years ago, before protective laws were brought in. And of course, the idea behind the shiny light or whatever is, of course, light reflecting off a gun, a gun barrel or whatever. And crows, for example, are smart enough to pick up on that. But the point is that I've done a lot of reading and writing about deterring hawks from coming after bird feeders, and that solution doesn't really stop them at all. I mean, maybe it's better to do that than nothing. It's the same thing with those plastic owls that one could buy. I wish I had a nickel for every one of those things that was sold around the world. Even my own university, Philip, asked me, said, look, we want to keep the pigeons off our buildings. They're pooping all over the buildings. Can we put up plastic owls? And I said, no, they won't work. I said, they'll work for a few days and that'll be the end of it. They didn't listen to me. And then the following spring, I had a great smug smile on my face as I walked around the campus and saw one of those plastic owls with a wire around its neck, and the thing was swinging back and forth in the wing, covered in pigeon poop. And so exactly, I mean, basically the pigeons would just simply sit on them after. It's the same with birds of prey. They're not going to be fooled by those kinds of things. So
Yeah.
so using up any kind of a bird of prey. But here are some things I thought, if I was going to try some different techniques and things that I read about for chickens, for example, you can buy mannequins. Now, I know you can make, people have used blow up dolls, believe it or not, and so on, like life size blow up dolls, and then put dresses on them and wigs and so on. But I was thinking, if I wanted something that would last a lot longer than that, because eventually those things deflate and you wasted your money, is to go to a store and buy a mannequin, dress it up, even to make it move a little bit. You could mount it on some kind of a, like a dish or something that spins around nice and easily on a bit of a spindle, and so that it moves around in the wind, and then having a wig on it, like long hair, and a dress that flutters in the wind, that would probably work well if you didn't mind having that kind of thing near your loft. Not everybody would.
Yeah, that's good yard art.
Yeah, and that's true. Another thing I thought about, that people are using in some places, that when you go by car dealerships and so on, and they use those blow up effigies of humans that wriggle back and forth, those put on some sort of a timer, wouldn't be a bad idea to try. I'm just giving you that kind of the idea of a scarecrow sort of thing. Hanging up effigies, I know that people have tried to keep turkey vultures that are roosting nearby to coming into town. They hang effigies of dead turkey vultures. They kill them and hang them up there, and there has been some talk about that working, but of course, that's not something that I would want people to encourage, to hang up dead hawks and falcons around their lofts and so on, because that would mean killing birds. Another thing I thought about, well, what about the sound deterrence? I did some reading about those things, and it seems to still hold true today that hawks and falcons are really not deterred. Certainly, if you play alarm call, that could end up attracting Cooper's hawks and peregrines to your neighborhood or whatever. But those ultrasonic things you can buy, and they can go for sometimes thousands of dollars. They don't seem to work. I did some reading on scientific testing of those things, and they don't work. Some people say they repel rats and mice and so on, but they don't really work. And so I would not waste money on any of those kinds of things. I will say that there is a potential live solution to keeping, at least giving your pigeons warning that there's a hawk in the area, is to put in guinea fowl. I was just at a chicken coop in Baja, Mexico, with a bird watching group there, and they had 2 or 3 guinea fowl. And I know guinea fowl are excellent in detecting birds of prey. And then they make these warning calls, and the warning calls eventually are learned by all of the birds of the area that, hey, there's a raptor nearby, so let's not leave the loft or whatever. But that means an extra mouth to feed or whatever. But it's a possible solution that might work in some cases.
I've heard people say, "Oh, guineas make good alarms." We've had guineas in the past, and every now and then, if I walk around the corner of a building and I startle one, it definitely sets off an alarm and
Yeah,
definitely does its job. That's really interesting. I didn't know that they kept their eyes out for birds of prey too.
birds of prey are actually one of their most greatest feared predator. Are the eagles that are in Africa in particular, where guinea fowl, 2 kinds of guinea fowl live. I've seen them over there. There are eagles over there that just love to feed on guinea fowl, but they have this warning system, so they're now highly attuned to them. So a lot of poultry flock owners will keep some guinea fowl among them. If you want a natural solution, that's one way to go.
Speaking of a natural solution, what about other birds like I think there's starlings or different varieties of small birds that you can put a little house up for that will either even chase away the birds of prey?
I'm not aware that anyone's used that or tried that. I mean, I know starlings very, very well, and they are fairly smart birds or whatever. But and certainly they would be quite a prone prey bird for something like a Cooper's hawk. Not so much peregrine. Peregrine I usually like to kill things in the air, although they have been known to take rats in dumps, actually, up in the Yukon, up in the north in Canada, probably as a last resort as opposed to killing birds. They really prefer to eat ducks and shorebirds and seabirds. Those are 3 main things. But they will take pigeons in cities, of course. And I know this because I released about 50 captive bred peregrine falcons in the city of Montreal with the intent of getting a pair going there now. And today, there used to be the famous sunlight birds there back in the 50s, where one female outlasted 3 males and raised 22 youngsters before dying at around 16 years of age or whatever. And so today there's probably at least 10 pairs of peregrines out there, which that's probably not good news for people who are keeping pigeons like yourself. And I understand that, but it's a matter of trying to find a common ground somewhere where I can go to a city and other people who never get to see peregrine falcons anywhere else can appreciate wildlife and vote in politicians who care about wildlife. And so if they get to see a peregrine falcon, in the city, it's a big deal. But on the other hand, I do respect the fact that these peregrines will then become nuisances for people like yourself. And I remember during the height of the releases of peregrine falcons, the Watts district of Los Angeles, there was a great conflict between the pigeon fanciers there and the falconers that were releasing the birds there. I mean, physical confrontations. So I haven't heard of that more recently, but I had during that same time, I remember hearing Ian Newton, who was one of the top bird of prey ecologists of our time. He gave a talk at a bird of prey conference at the Raptor Research Foundation. He showed a picture of his hands filled with the little plastic rings from pigeons that he had found in all of the peregrine falcon nests, not in the cities, but out in the wild in Scotland. Like a whole double handful of these things. And these pigeons were literally, it was mostly racing pigeons. They would let these things go thousands and thousands at a time. And of course, peregrine falcons are going to say, oh boy, there's a buffet dinner for us.
Right.
And they would wait for them and then take them back and feed them to their babies. And of course, the rings would get left in the nest. I got contacted by a British professor, and he said, listen, I got a crazy idea. Do you think that we could do some research with my falcon colony? I had a falcon colony of about 300 American kestrels, which I used for research, which was the subject of many of those scientific papers. Do you think that we could actually get pigeon fanciers to dye their pigeons a certain color that basically tells peregrines that they're not going to taste good? It's called aversive conditioning. And so we took these little yellow day-old cockerels, which are basic day-old chickens, right, that I fed my colony. And we would give kestrels, a big sample size, a choice between eating 4 different cockerels. One would be the yellow one, the normal color. Another would be blue. Another one was green. And I forget what the third color was. So we actually dyed 3 of the 4 different colors. And then we had these 2 chemicals we worked with that taste bad to birds. They're a known taste deterrents. And so what we try to do to see if the kestrels would avoid eating a bird, a cockerel, that tasted bad. And what we found out is that the only color that the kestrels avoided eating was blue. If there was a cockerel, blue, then they would even eat the non-colored one if it had the bad tasting chemical in it. They would eat that before eating a blue cockerel. So we published that in the Journal of Raptor Research, but nothing ever came of it. No one ever bothered saying, well, let's think about dyeing our pigeons blue or whatever. I mean, there's a little bit of that's not an easy thing for you to do. You like your pigeons, you like the looks of them and so on, and dyeing them a blue color is not necessarily the way to go. And it might not work for peregrines. It worked for these kestrels, but it might not work for peregrines. And so what happened after that kind of stuff got published, the pigeon fanciers, some of the more less desirable types, were actually using pigeons with explosives on them and remote devices like sacrificial pigeons to blow up the peregrine and the pigeon in the air. And some of them were affixing scalpel blades to the legs of some pigeons as well to harm the peregrines. That was about the height, I would say, of the animosity between pigeon fanciers and peregrine falcon lovers. I don't know if it's as heavy today. I don't hear these stories today like it did before. So maybe there's some common ground being found, I hope.
I know that in especially Southern California area where the Birmingham roller community is huge down there. They got the birds that roll in the air.
Yes.
They're way more of a flashing, how would you say, like an easy meal for a bird of prey if they saw a bird tumbling like that.
Yep.
What a lot of the roller guys are saying is that, they just keep the birds of prey are not leaving. They don't migrate. They sit there, they reproduce. And so now it's just like some of these guys are breeding hundreds of birds just to keep enough to fly, an A team of 20 birds or whatever, because they're just getting hit every time they fly.
Yeah.
Would a bird of prey do that? Would a bird of prey not migrate if it has a constant food source?
That's what the birds in the cities are doing. A lot of the peregrine. The reason that we had peregrines use a nest box placed on a building in 1982 and 1984, they chose because there were several peregrines hanging around the city of Montreal in the middle of winter. And Montreal has some, in those days, some pretty icy, cold, snowy winters. But the peregrines were basically living off the various pigeons in the cities and so on. And then in the spring, when it was breeding season, they would sometimes not just take peregrines, but they would also take birds migrating through the city. So yeah, I think it's possible that, I mean, the two things that limit bird of prey populations are this. One of them is food supply, and the other one is nesting sites. And if they have both those things, then unless it's a totally hostile environment, like absolutely so cold, but even then, there are peregrines, falcons there. I mean, peregrine falcons are in the Arctic. So I'm not surprised about that. I did do some other reading about some of the things that other pigeon fanciers are trying. Is that there's two aspects. There's when you let your birds leave the loft, that you should alter that, like rotate it a little bit, so that the falcons and the Cooper's hawks don't get attenuated to when the birds are going to leave. Not everybody wants to do that because apparently pigeon fanciers like to have some consistency in when they let their birds go. So that's not an easy solution for them. And the other thing was instead of putting up, I think you call them, is it a kit?
Oh, right. Yeah. Put up a kit of rollers. Yeah.
Like a kit of, say, 15 to 20 pigeons, put up only maybe 4 or 5 or 6 at a time. You know, if you put up a lot of pigeons at one time, that's going to be more obvious to a peregrine or a Cooper's hawk than a small number of birds. It doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, it'll work, but certainly I know that based on the reading I did is that people were losing less birds, but they just weren't getting to put out the flights that they'd like to put out, like the larger number of birds.
Right.
But they were losing less. So, you know, it all depends. It's all a matter of the balance, isn't it? Weighing it out of losing, when you lose a valuable bird to a bird of prey, one that maybe wins a lot of races or whatever, that could be a very expensive proposition.
And we've had success with mixing fly times as well. When my son was doing the rollers, he would every day after school turn them out. And we would look up in the sky. You know, we got really wide open skies out here. Okay, there's nothing. And as soon as we turn them out, you know, this dude just comes out of nowhere. He must have been so high up there. On the other side of it, too, I've heard of guys who will be like, I'm going to fly my B team first. And if something gets hit out of that, then, you know, predator cessation, you know,
Yeah.
it's done. And then I'll fly my A team. But what about this? Are they more likely to hunt mornings, evenings, you know, middle of the day? Is a rhyme or reason to the time they're out?
Yeah, birds of prey are somewhat lazier than some birds. I mean, they're not up at the crack of dawn like the dawn chorus, you know, where you get the robins and other thrushes and warblers all singing, you know, almost to the crack of dawn. Birds of prey will get up a little bit later than that. But I'd say late morning would probably be peak hunting time. But, you know, if they're not successful in getting something, they're going to keep on hunting till they do. But the good thing about peregrines and Cooper's hawks and other birds of prey is that they're not like weasels, you know, they don't go and just kill for the fun of it. They basically kill to feed themselves. Now, whether they just eat, I know peregrines will feed on the breast meat and so on and leave actually a certain telltale ring of bones. You can almost tell a peregrine kill by the way the bird is left, but they love the breast meat or whatever. Owls, for example, will rip the heads off and eat that before anything else. I have another thing you were asking me earlier about what can you do to keep a Cooper's hawk or even a peregrine from coming near your loft, say if you're on the top of a building or something, or even not, maybe just in a, you know, on a farm area or whatever. And that's putting up a hot wire perch. Now I hadn't thought of that before, but I was just looking at some pictures a little while ago where you put up a, you know, a high pole with a perch on it. I don't know all the details about how to make these, but you could use solar to power it. And basically it gives a mild jolt of electricity to anything sitting on there. Now, the reason that might work for a bird of prey is they often like to survey their surroundings before they decide to make a kill or whatever. So if you put up a pole with some kind of a T-perch on the top that's got some kind of wiring on it, that you don't want to fry the bird because that's illegal, but a small jolt of electricity, and the details, you could find them on the internet because I found them, and I thought that was a very interesting possibility as a solution to make it, because once the bird of prey lands in that, and every time it lands, it gets a mild jolt, it's going to say, yeah, this is not a good place. I'll go hunt somewhere else. So that might work.
I never heard of that. Now, I have heard of guys putting up a pole with a platform on it for their birds to kind of come down quick as like a hopping point, come down and then get in the loft, come down, give them a spot if they don't have a spot, if
Yeah.
there's nothing around, instead of just coming in hot right to the loft, they'll put that up there and train the birds that way too. But I've never heard one for that.
I think another thing too, Philip, is that when someone's feeding birds in their backyard, like I do, for example, if you don't want hawks to nail your birds, then you should make sure that there's some cover nearby, not cover to allow cats to hide in, mind you, but cover so that they can dive into the cover in a hurry. And Cooper's hawks are so smart that, and I know this for a fact, that they'll sometimes come in out of nowhere. They're ambush predators. They'll just sit and wait. And then as soon as they see the flock building up on the feeders, they come dashing in. And of course, the flock scatters, and often they hit windows. And then they're easy prey for the Cooper's hawk to go and grab one. There have even been
Wow.
cases where a Cooper's hawk has chased a bird into the window, and both the Cooper's hawk and the bird they were chasing died from smacking the window. I mean, billions of birds get killed hitting windows, but that apparently has become a bit of a hunting technique for Cooper's hawks, and maybe they've grown to understand the windows a little bit better. I mean, all this to say is that if you have a pigeon loft, having the loft is the place to escape, obviously, but for the hawks, you do not want to give them any kind of a vantage point unless it's a hot wire perch. You don't want to give them any kind of advantage where they can hide. So getting rid of any places where a Cooper's hawk could hide and ambush your birds as they're coming into the loft to me is a no-brainer.
So, can you offer any other type of advice to promote a safe environment for the pigeons against the presence of birds of prey?
I've worked with drones for 13 years, studying the use of drones to study wildlife. Counting falcons, babies in the nest, counting shorebirds in a flock, nesting birds, and all sorts of different things. And I was trying to think of some way that one might use this interesting technology to help. But the problem is that there are many cases that drones end up annoying peregrine falcons and other birds of prey so much, not necessarily Cooper's hawks, but certainly peregrines. The peregrines will actually attack the drones and knock them out of the
Oh,
sky.
yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah, and you can find numerous videos and reports of that on YouTube or whatever. But I was trying to think of a way that you could use a drone somehow. And I know they use them at airports, for example, where they actually look like a bird of prey. And that's nothing new. That was done in the 60s by Transport Canada, where they had a remote controlled airplane that looked like a goshawk and tried that. But the problem is that the prey birds, the ducks and the gulls and so on, they habituate to a drone that doesn't kill them. After a while, they say, "Oh, here comes that noisy machine again." But let's not bother leaving because it's not going to do anything to us. And so the idea of using falconry at airports, occasionally you put the drone out there, and then occasionally you throw in the live falcon and it kills something. So they never know, oh, is that the live falcon coming or is it the drone? And I just read somewhere, this is brand new to me, that they're actually using drones to herd birds away from the runways at airports. So I was trying to think, could you use a drone somehow to herd a raptor away from your pigeon flocks? But that's very intensive and so on. Oh, there is one more thing that I think is worth trying. I know for a fact, and this has not been published to my knowledge, that birds do not like green laser beams. I'm not talking about red ones or whatever, but green ones. They don't like green laser beams. And you can go on the internet, Philip, and look at type in laser beams helping farmers in California. And so these farmers now that have these problems with starling flocks coming in and eating their berries or their grains or whatever, put up these laser guns on poles on the corners of their crops. And what they do is they just randomly fire off laser beams all over the place. Apparently, it's about 95% effective. So could you put
Wow.
a laser gun on the roof? Now, right away, I know what you're thinking because I'm thinking the same thing. You're probably not going to get permission from the FAA to do that because, I mean, people can get in big trouble, be thrown in jail for firing laser beams off at planes landing in runways and so on, which is the stupidest thing I've heard anyone ever do, but they do it. I don't think it's going to work for pigeon loss, but they are allowed to use them legally in these crops in California. So I would love to put a laser beam on a drone to use to disperse starlings at vineyards, for example. I even suggested in a talk, there was a Transport Canada guy in the audience, and he came to me after. He says, "My boss wants to speak to you." And he said, he says, "We are having enough trouble trying to regulate drones, and putting laser beams on them as well is just a bridge too far."
Well, they do have, I've seen those green lasers and they got them like little like pin size ones.
Yep. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Try to shine it on a BOP if you see one coming around your birds.
And I think it would probably work if you're willing to do that. Spend the time out there. Just carry one in your jacket all the time. And if you see a falcon or a hawk hanging around the area, then give it a shot. And you're not going to hurt the bird in any way. It's just going to be annoyed by it and leave. Bird watchers actually use either red or green laser beams to point birds out to their clients. They're taking people out. Let's just say I'm trying to show a rare bird in some deep foliage in a jungle to a bunch of bird watchers, whatever. I don't put the laser beam right on the bird. I say, okay, 3 feet to the left of my little laser dot, you'll find the bird we're looking for. Just wiggling it back and forth and flying it and shooting it toward a raptor. And it's possible that the bird of prey might think, I don't want to go near Philip Fry's place because there's those awful laser beams there. They're pretty smart birds, and they might get it in their heads. I'll go bother David Bird's pigeons instead.
Well, I mean, yeah, this is good. You've given a lot of like practical things that people can try, and it's going to be based on, like you said, what kind of bird of prey you're dealing with, and what you're
Yep.
in the city, you're in the country. But you've given a lot of really good ideas.
Well, there's actually, Philip, one other group of birds I haven't mentioned yet, and that's owls. In the cities, the main owls that you got to watch out for pigeon fanciers, I think, would be certainly great horned owls, which are the most common owl. They're the big ones with the ear tufts sticking straight up. And there's another owl now that's found all over North America called barred owls, but they don't tend to take pigeons all that much. They're more of a mouse and a rabbit eater than anything. And then you've got barn owls, and barn owls have been known to actually go into lofts, kill pigeons inside a loft as well, because they can get into. I mean, they nest in holes, so they're able to do that sort of thing. So those guys, as I said, putting up those fake owls, not going to do anything for them at all. That's a more difficult problem. I don't know how often that happens. Have you lost any pigeons to owls yourself?
Not the owls, no.
I don't think it's as significant a problem as it is with the Cooper's hawks, which do love pigeon-sized birds. I got to tell you one last little funny story. I have this modest house down in Baja, Mexico, that I spend the winters down there, and I feed the birds in the backyard. And I actually get a flock in of roughly about 30 to 40, as many as 50 white-winged doves. They're the most common dove-like, pigeon-like bird there. And I deliberately throw out handfuls of chicken scratch to them and bring them in so that I can attract the local Cooper's hawk to come in and entertain me with taking one of those things. It hasn't worked yet, but I have had Cooper's hawks come in and scare the heck out of those doves. So it just makes good theater for me.
Like I told you, I belong to the Arizona State Pigeon Club, and in our club, there's multiple falconers. They're not just there to get the cold birds either. They're bird people.
Yep, they love birds.
We like watching them and doing their thing and stuff like that. And there's got to be, like you say, there has to be a balance. You don't even want to mess around with shooting these things. They're federally protected. There's other ways. We just went over a ton of different things that you could do that are legal.
I'm not saying that any of those things I've suggested will necessarily work, but they're worth experimenting with at least.
Right.
And I love problems like this. If I had a grant, I mean, I'm getting a little bit long in the tooth now, unfortunately. I'm not taking on any more students. I'm still a professor at McGill, emeritus. That's what that means. But I love problems like this. But I suspect that probably each situation is somewhat different. I mean, maybe you might be in a city where there's a lot of peregrines around. LA is one of them, of course. Chicago, New York City are loaded with peregrine falcons, and all the major cities in Canada have them. Or you might be in another area where you've got to worry about Cooper's hawks and not peregrines. And so every situation is going to be a little different. I think things worth trying to summarize would be the use of those guinea fowl. If you don't mind having extra mouths to feed, the laser pen might work. The mannequins and blow up effigies that just every once in a while they blow up or whatever might make a peregrine think twice about going anywhere near your loft, or a Cooper's hawk. Those are the things that I think I would try before anything else. Another thing you might try is you can buy these coyote decoys. They're full-size decoys. I've seen them placed in fields to keep geese away. And I know that birds of prey do not like coyotes. Another animal you could get or you could make would be a raccoon. They do not like raccoons. And another thing they don't like are snakes. And I noticed there's an article showing that people that are keeping poultry and other birds, and maybe pigeon fanciers as well, can have a snake hanging on a wire, not a coiled snake, but a one that looks like it's moving, and have it move around in the wind. And apparently they do not like that either, and either do owls for that matter. So you might want to think about that one.
Well, these are all great. And David, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing some of this with us. You can check out Professor David Bird's website at askprofessorbird.com. He has a lot of information on there about all the stuff that he does. David, thanks for coming on and talking with us. It's been great.
It's my great pleasure, Philip. And I wish you the very best, and may your pigeons be safe.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, coming out of that one on the birds of prey, let's shift gears a bit. The next story takes us on a completely different direction, but it's one of the most powerful stories in the history of pigeons. Here is the story of Cher-Ami, the war pigeon.
Today we have with us Jim Falsone. He is the lead on Veterans Radio podcast. He is a veterans disability lawyer and served in the late 1970s. He's been on air with the Veterans Radio since 2014. He has built Legal Help for Veterans PLLC into one of the premier veteran disability firms in the country. Jim has also written a book on Cher-Ami and pigeons who have served in the war, and we're going to talk about that today. So, Jim, thanks for coming on and talking with us.
Well, Philip, glad to be here, and with my many things I do in the veteran space. I'm a veteran myself, and as you mentioned, a veterans disability lawyer with Legal Help for Veterans. That got us involved in Veterans Radio, which has been on the air for 21 years, and doing podcasts for about 6 of them now. So every week we publish something new at veteransradio.org. And along the way, I started writing about issues interesting that I thought were interesting to veterans, and many of them are found at a website called homeofheroes.com, which has all kinds of stories on Medal of Honor recipients and Silver Star recipients, and other things I found interesting. And one of them was the story of Cher-Ami. So as time goes on, you start accumulating more and more information. And you say, well, I didn't know that. I got to push something out about that. And that's how we got here.
Okay. Yeah, it is definitely a lot of people, I feel like, are just completely unaware about the role that pigeons served in wartime. I mean, just completely unaware about it.
It's really, when you say it out loud, it becomes really simple, because military maneuvers are all about communication. It's about what headquarters wants you to do and what the guy in the field can actually get done. And oftentimes those aren't the same things, because the headquarters doesn't have the right information. So you need a way to communicate between the front line and back where the troops are headquartered, where those generals are, if you will. And so you have to have communication. And we live in an age where you and I are doing this over the internet, where everything's digital and technology-wise, but you don't have to go very far back. Before there were cell phones, before there was internet, before there was GPS. And now you get yourself into, well, how did they communicate? How did the forces know what to do and what they were facing? And really, pigeons have been involved in military affairs at least as far back as 1878. And were involved in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. I think they got out of it about March of 1957. But a long history and valiant service by pigeons to allow communications at the very highest and most impressive levels.
Absolutely. I had my uncle J.R. Williams was in the Pigeon Signal Corps in World War II, and there were some pretty, really neat articles about that and how they did the training and things like this. And really, I think like Cher-Ami is probably the most, for the people who do know, she's the most well-known. Well, first off, I guess you wrote the book on this, and when I hear the story, I hear it said both ways. Do you know if Cher-Ami was a hen or a cockbird?
I have heard primarily that it was a he.
Okay, we'll just say that then.
We'll say that Cher-Ami passed in 1918, so it's a long time ago. any way you look at it, nobody was around who really knows the truth. Maybe the Smithsonian does, because that's where Cherami resides.
That's right. Yeah. So she's still there. She's all taxidermied up in at the Smithsonian, right?
Absolutely, and she's one of a number. I think there's 3 or 4 others that were so significant in their military service. They have the same honor.
Let's get into the meat and potatoes on this. Can you give us a breakdown of the story of Cher Ami?
Yeah, and again, you got to think back to World War I, where there were no cellular communications. The Americans were over in France, fighting in France, and to communicate, you had to string copper wire between the frontline troops and headquarters. So it was easy to disrupt communications by cutting the wires, which both sides did to each other. Also, World War I was a trench warfare. So a lot of the troops, dug trenches and were fighting from below ground. So again, not a great way to be able to communicate. You couldn't use signals, you couldn't use lights. There were no real radio communications at that point in time. The general in charge of that French expeditionary force for the U.S. was General John Pershing, Blackjack Pershing. Great name for a general. Blackjack Pershing got to France and he realized, my troops are out there, and he was a guy who wanted to be at the front of the troops. But he said, I can't communicate with them. He actually did 2 things. One of them's, both of them are very interesting. One of them's relevant to this conversation. He had 800 pigeons brought over by the Signal Corps to France because he knew that they would be successful in flying their routes and communicating. The other thing he should do that should be mentioned in passing, at least, he made a call to French-speaking American women, single women, who were working for AT&T, and he brought them over, I think around 500, something like 2,000 volunteered, but about 500 came over to France and worked as telephone operators on the front lines because they were faster and better than the army soldiers who were trying to connect calls between headquarters and connecting with the French troops and the folks in the trenches. These women were somewhat known as hello girls, have a whole interesting history themselves. But the pigeons really got used by Pershing to send out with the frontline troops so that if there was no wire communications, which in many places there weren't, you could release the pigeons with messages back to headquarters, and Pershing's command could get the latest intel of where artillery was needed, where troops needed to be strengthened, that sort of thing. And what's really amazing is the claim that 90% of those missions flown by the pigeons for Blackjack Pershing were successful. The message got through.
That's a good percent. That's very effective.
I don't know about you, but my cell phone doesn't work that often. So Cher Ami, who I think was born in the fall of 1918, made his or her way to France. She flew 12 missions, came back from France wounded. She had received injury to her eye, her leg, and had taken a graze in the breast from a bullet because both sides knew the others were using pigeons to communicate. And so shooting them down was fair game. She came back to the United States, ultimately passed away in June of 1919. If you think about it, didn't have a very long life, but in those 12 missions, 12 successful missions, because you don't come back unless it's a successful mission, really contributed to the war effort. And there's one, really the last famous battle that she was instrumental in that, if you'd like it, I'd be willing to talk about.
Yeah, absolute. That's kind of like her glory story right there.
It really is. There was a lost battalion, and again, if any of your listeners are interested, they can Google Lost Battalion World War I, and all kinds of stories will pop up. And what had happened is, in this trench warfare, some American troops dug in at the side of a hill, were really surrounded by the Germans and couldn't find a way out. The headquarters wasn't exactly sure where they were at, pulled in artillery fire onto where they thought they were at this hill. The only problem is it was inaccurate. Without good information, the artillerymen can't do their jobs right. Ultimately, the major who was involved, Major Whitsley, used his last pigeon, Cherami, wrote a quick and simple note, attached it to her leg and sent her off. The note was, so this is really interesting because it's so abbreviated, right? So the note was simply, we are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. That was the note. And made its war back to artillery. They adjusted their sights and ultimately pounded the Germans enough to free up the lost battalion. But all of that couldn't have happened without this, if you will, scrawny little bird.
Yeah.
Communicating back to headquarters what was so critical, so important, which was coordinates. Where are you? We're trying to help. They certainly didn't want friendly fire to occur. So it became really a life-saving mission that Cherami had, and ultimately the lost battalion was no longer lost. As a result, Cherami received the French Croix de Bois, one of its highest awards in military terms. It also received medals for bravery. It was the British, I believe, gave it a Dickin Medal, which is for gallantry under fire. So there was a real recognition of the immense value played by this little bird in its efforts to let the artillery folks, know where the lost battalion was.
And how many soldiers were in that battalion? Do you remember? I think the number was a decent amount of men too.
I think there were less. They may have started at 500. They were under 200 at the time that it occurred, and they were getting wiped out, and they would have been wiped out.
Wow.
That's not the only pigeon that there's a real history for during World War I. Some of the names are somewhat famous, and I don't have the details on all of their missions, but there's a pigeon known as Mocker, Mocker, who lost an eye and is noted in the literature. Another one called President Wilson, who lost a foot. G.I. Joe, famous one that helped troops in Italy and saved a town where the United States Air Force, Army Air at the time, was going to bomb this Italian town because it thought the Germans still had control, and it was a pigeon that flew back the information that the Germans had left, thereby saving the town and saving the civilians from this, what would have been a horrific bombing raid. To give you an example of how it was used both ways, there's a famous World War I German pigeon, which we in the United States call Kaiser. At the end of the war, Kaiser and 9 of his mates were captured, brought back to the United States, and actually toured the United States as pigeon POWs.
Oh, wow.
As a way to raise, I'm sure, bond money for the United States Army.
Yeah.
And Kaiser had a pretty good life, pretty good POW life. He lasted 31 years, died in 1949.
Wow.
During that time, he sired 75 pigeons that the Army Signal Corps put to use, primarily in World War II.
That's incredible. 31 years.
And as I said, I think the Signal Corps took pretty good care of him. And he turned out to be probably the longest POW pigeon ever held. So
wow.
I thought that was pretty interesting. And I said earlier that Cherami is in the Smithsonian, but so is Kaiser, and a couple of other pigeons by the name of Global Girl and Anzio Boy, who played different roles in World War II. Anzio Boy, as you might imagine, flew missions in Italy. So it's there's a long history of this, and you don't have to go too far back to see the importance of pigeons in communications in wartime efforts.
I got younger kids, so we've got some of the, I think the GI Joe is one of the kids books we have, and there's a kids book on Share Me, and there's also a lot of like YouTube animations. So anybody with kids or teachers out there for other kids, there's some pretty good places where you can watch these stories also.
One of the things that is so interesting, and you're kind of help keeping it alive with All About Pigeons podcast, is this whole idea of how intelligent homing pigeons are,
Yeah.
how capable they are. Now, us over on the Veterans Radio side, we think it's an interesting story, but we don't know, we don't appreciate maybe the level at which the training went on, the breeding went on, because the Army sold off its last pigeons in March of 1957.
Yeah.
So it's a long time since the Army would have utilized homing pigeons.
And that to me, I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts because we've heard about the Army in China that they've actually been going the other way. They bought like 4,000 breeders a couple of years ago, which means they probably got 8,000 pigeons today. They're still doing it. I think France still has a pigeon corps. I mean, what are your thoughts about that, Jim? I mean, what do you think about us getting rid of that?
It's interesting you raise this because as I was getting prepped for this show, Philip, and thinking about this more, it turned from a curiosity to a national security issue.
Right.
If you think about, and I didn't know what China was doing, that even makes me more concerned. But if you think about, and we've certainly had programs on EMPs, weapons. If you think about cyber attacks, you knock down our satellites, you knock out our GPS, you knock down our communications. We're going to be right back to where we need the pigeons.
Yeah.
We are so dependent on the electronics today. You cut our underwater cables for internet, and we're blocked off from countries on the west and on the east coast, right? So, yeah, I would think it's worth at least thinking about. Should there be some specialty in understanding how this can be a tool for the military, which has a long history of using animals successfully in warfare, whether it's horses, dogs. The dogs in Afghanistan and Iraq are well known.
Right.
Dolphins. Maybe it would be prudent to think about coming back around to this, and particularly if China's doing it, there might be a reason why China's doing it. Cutting communications to Taiwan, for example. But it also takes a community like yours that are breeders and racers of pigeons to step up and say, hey, I can help.
Yeah.
In a world where the U.S. military is all about, it's a volunteer corps, very few of us know somebody or are involved with somebody who's actually participating in keeping the peace around the world. And I'm sure if that time came, the pigeon community would come forward.
Yeah, I wish that we still had something, one loft, just give us one loft out there and just to play with it. There was still, I think it was in, I'm probably gonna get the country wrong, in India or something that was actually still doing a optional delivery service using pigeons. And there's some company here in the States that will deliver letters. It's kind of like a short distance sort of a thing, just kind of a novelty thing. But I still think, they're always they've been a part of human existence for thousands of years. They're not just going to get irrelevant because we have smartphones now. And to put all of our trust and faith into that, I think that would be really helpful. And I don't know how true this is, but have you ever come across anything where because like you said, both countries where everybody uses pigeons during the war, were there any countries that were using falconry at all to take down the pigeons? I mean, short of just shooting at them?
I'm not aware of the falconry use. The British had a lot of pigeons involved in the war effort in World War II in particular. And you can imagine the ability to fly back across the channel. And something like 32 British pigeons received the Dickin Medal for gallantry under fire. So that gives you some sense of the level of effort that was being used by the British. But I'm not aware of falconry. I'm aware of, as I say, it was fair game to shoot at them. And actually in World War II, there was a Army technical memo, which I, in looking at it, thought it was kind of comical but serious, on how to release pigeons from aircraft.
Oh,
That was sort of interesting. I do know that they were often strapped in cage to paratroopers who would jump out of airplanes, and then when got them down on the ground, that's how they would get them there. But they were also apparently released from the aircraft, which I find sort of interesting. But they also didn't fly at the same speeds, and they weren't jets sucking in everything either. So at one time, this was a real serious endeavor by the U.S. Army Signal Corps.
I heard a story too about it was a ship that was going down, and it was when the pigeon came back, they did the triangulation based on how fast the pigeon can fly when it got there, and they were able to find the boat, whereas otherwise, the ocean's so fast that it just would have been hard to even find the sailors out there.
It doesn't surprise me. I mean, again, those are the kind of stories and those are the sorts of creative efforts that the Army and the Navy would have used with trying to have communications and recognizing, hey, pigeons are our best way to communicate in the world at that time.
During the Allied effort, is it true that a lot of, like you're saying, that there was horses and dogs and pigeons? So when the war was over, did those animals get left behind? Obviously, Sharamee came back probably because of the status of her and everything else, but did the other ones just get left back there?
Many were left behind. It's one of the real efforts that they tried to make out of Afghanistan, is to bring the search and rescue dogs back somewhat successfully. History will tell us over time how successfully. When you watch history unfold, you don't really get the full truth. You get the sanitized version. But we've had a number of stories on veteransradio.org where dog handlers have told their stories about how difficult it was to get them to clear their dog back to the United States. A dog named Fred that was not a qualified service dog was smuggled back into the United States with some hoodwinking of DHL carriers to get it out of Afghanistan to Germany and ultimately to the United States. It's a great dog story, but it just shows you the love and the commitment and connection that soldiers have to these animals, such as these pigeons, who have helped them, who have shared risks with them, who have been injured like they may have been injured. I told you earlier about lost eyes and legs and shot in the breast and all of that. I mean, those are all things with men in combat would really relate to and have strong attachments to as a result.
Oh, yeah. And the reason they were getting left was it was a quarantine situation, right? They just didn't want to bring back a bunch of animals in case one of them had something.
Absolutely, it is. It's a concern for the safety of other animals and people back in the United States, all with good merit and measure. This is an interesting little slice of avian history, a little interesting slice of veteran history, and it's great that we can kind of connect the two.
Yeah.
People may get motivated to go do some of their own research on some of these issues, so they understand the long, proud history that raising and racing pigeons has.
Absolutely. And so people can find the book on Sharamee that you wrote at homeofheroes.com.
Right.
They can listen to your guys' podcast on veteransradio.org. I found you guys on Spotify as well. So if you just search Veterans Radio.
We're like you. We're on all the major platforms at this
Excellent.
point. We've been doing this so long, so we're glad to have new listeners and always glad to have new ideas about stories that may be of interest to veterans and their friends.
Yes, absolutely. Well, this has been a great one. And Jim, thanks for coming on and talking with us and enlightening everybody a little bit here.
Well, Philip, I'm glad you reached out. It's been fun, and keep doing all the good work you're doing, spreading the word about these all important pigeons.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jim.
An awesome story, and one that really shows the impact pigeons have had throughout history and our relationship with them. Beyond the stories, there's also a whole world of science behind these birds. So from history to science, let's go ahead and dive into phylogenetics.
Today we have a listener requested episode on color genetics, and we have here with us Drew Lobenstein to talk about that. Drew has been a master judge from the National Pigeon Association. He is a member of the National Pigeon Association Hall of Fame and has received the NPA Lifetime Achievement Award. Drew has been published in at least 5 languages for his work in genetics and has traveled the world to judge and lecture on the subject. Drew, thanks for coming on and talking with us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Phil. It's especially talking genetics. There's a bunch of us that speak in the genetic groups, and some people think it's an actual foreign language. But we'll try to clear that up today for everybody.
Absolutely. Let's make it simple. Make us all pros at the end of this.
Absolutely. We love talking to people who are open to hearing some things about pigeons and genetics and what it is that drives that passion that we have for these birds.
So can we talk about your own experiences with genetics, some of the colors and patterns that you've personally been responsible for creating?
There's some basic stuff out there. We in Southern California, we had the great privilege of having a whole bunch of genetic people. We met at Joe Frazier's house out in El Monte once a month. There would be a gathering of genetic nuts, basically, and the conversations would go into all kinds of crazy stuff about genetics. But if you look in Wendell Levi's book, Encyclopedia of Pigeon Breeds, you will see Joe Frazier's dilute checker opal giant homer hen, and whatever page it is in the encyclopedia, it's one of the most beautiful pigeons I've ever laid eyes on. And just to see, well, a person, a human being, a man, a human, could take the genetic characters and put them all on one bird and make something that beautiful. And without Joe Frazier, that bird never would have existed. But here's the basic stuff. In pigeons, there are 3 ground colors, and it doesn't get any more basic than that. There are 3, and the primary colors in pigeon include what they call wild type, which is blue or blue-black. There's ash red, which they call dominant red. If you go to Europe, they will refer to it as dominant red. And the 3rd color in pigeon is brown. And so you can take those 3 colors, the basic colors, blue or blue-black, ash red, and brown, and then the whole rest of the world is modifiers. So there are hundreds, maybe thousands of modifiers out there that you can take these 3 colors and you can just paint the world with them. All the pigeons in the planet will fit into those 3 colors, and somewhere in the mix there will be up to several hundred, maybe I say 1,000, of different things that would modify those 3 colors. The more common thing that everybody will know is that the patterns in each one of those colors can occur. Now, the basic patterns, you're going to have barless, most recessive. That's the lowest on the pattern panel. The one above that one would be bar. So bar is dominant over barless. Barless isn't dominant over anything because there's nothing below it. You would have open checker. Open checker would be dominant over bar and barless. And then in saturated or T-pattern checker, which is a darker checker, and then saturated checker, which is like Jacobins, and those are the checker mod. Then you can have that modifier they call spread, and if you put spread on, say, a dark pattern checker, saturated checker, it becomes a black. If you put spread on ash red, it becomes what they call a red straw. And so you can open the wings and you can see lightning factors between at the quills. They only go light. You can tell the strawberry is basically an influence on those feathers. And the spread on brown, it just makes it go like olive dark, beautiful spread brown. And then depending on what else is underneath it, you can have those all on the same bird. But you can go spread and bar or spread and checker or spread and saturated checker and produce all kinds of different varieties of things. So whatever combinations are out there. In the middle of this, all of those things that I will call modifiers, there are a bunch of dominant modifiers. There are something called co-dominant modifiers. There are sex-linked modifiers, and then there are what we call autosomal modifiers. The dominant ones, everything comes, whatever that dominates. If you go to the Mendel's law, you go in any of the pieces of work that do numbers on genetics and figure it out. It was like Gregor Mendel, who did all his work with sweet peas, and he figured out there was this Mendelian ratio. So if you have dominant traits and recessive traits, and you make them to each other, and then you make the offspring to each other, there is a specific number of chances you get to have the recessive trait reappear. And so it has a 1 in 4 chance if you made, like for instance, I'm doing this right now, I'm doing barless Jacobins and barless fantails. Barless is the lowest one on the scale, patterns anyway. So if you take a barless and you made it to a bar, then those bars that come, all the babies will be bar the first generation. And all of those bars coming from that mating will also carry barless. But you don't know on the next generation, if you raise bars out of those birds, you can't tell whether they're carrying barless or not. You have to like test them. Or if you're really tricky, like Andrew Kearns in, in Virginia, he opened the wing and he can see the bars carrying barless because the patterns go on there, the things that his great eye could pick up. But what I've done, and which is easier, is I would take a barless and made it to a checker, and all of the babies that are checker are carrying barless. And so you have all these checkers carrying barless. And if you make those checkers carrying barless to a bar, well, guess what happens? The bar is dominant over barless, but it's not dominant over checker. So every one of the babies that comes from those checkers carrying barless on a blue bar, every time a bar baby shows up, it's carrying barless. You don't have to test it because you know the dominant recessive trait. So you watch your mathematics. But you can go into 2 generations breeding with that if you know this little trick. And you can produce the birds for skipping a generation without having to take a whole year to test them out to see if they're carrying that genetic project that you're, or that character that you're looking for. In my own lifetime, is working on sex-linked recessive traits, and that's even more fun because you can put 3 or 4 of those all together, and you can go on for 3 or 4 generations testing without having to test. That's kind of cool. In the program, though, you have like the dominant. Some of the dominant genetic stuff. Like a few fish, you have a cockbird that's almond. Almond will show up in this normal color, and it carries. Let me go back. Females carry 1 gene for color. They're what we refer to as hemizygous. Hemizygous. In Jacobin pigeons, the males carry 2 genes for color. The male Jacobin, for instance, can carry 1 gene for almond and 1 gene for something else. And so the almond gene, if it hits another almond gene, the baby looks really different. It doesn't look like an almond, it looks white. And they oftentimes are gifted with something called bladder eyes. So a homozygous almond is always a male. There's no way to produce a female homozygous almond. It's just, it can't be done. And they generally have some initial genetic stuff that goes on there with the eyes that manifest themselves. An awful lot of almonds will have cracked eyes or they have issues with eyes already. But 2 almonds together, a male almond, a female almond, and every male that's bred from that has both genes for almond will be white in color, and it'll have maybe some issues with the eyes, sometimes not. They might be blind, they might have bladder eyes, which are these like the, I don't know, the goldfish, the black moor, where the eyes pop out, they're bigger, and they look like bubbles on them. Sometimes that doesn't happen. They just be pure white with a normal looking eye. But for the most part, you can make 2 almonds together, and the likelihood you would raise one of those white males with a bladder eye is like only 1 in 4. So 3 of the 4 chances you're going to have something else, you know, an almond that isn't having any difficulties and is normal and recognizable. One of the other dominant traits is called opal. Opal doesn't look any different when you put it on cocks or hens. They look exactly the same. But in opal, dominant opal, there's another characteristic that comes along with that particular modifier, which they refer to as a lethal gene. And so if 2 opals are together, opal cockbird and an opal hen, those produce in a homozygous state. If they produce an offspring that is opal and opal, will be a cockbird, has to be opal and opal has to be a cockbird. It also carries that lethal gene within the opal. They generally die in the eggshell. So you look at, you know, have eggs and one's fertile and the other one's not. It could possibly be that the germinating embryo in the egg died, you know, before it ever started to develop. Homozygous opals generally don't live. They don't exist because the lethal gene is there when those 2 get put together. But any opal mated to anything else, 50% of the babies are going to be opal. And you've made an opal hen on anything else. The opal is dominant coming from the hen. So half of the babies will be opal and half not. If you're moving it to something that's not opal, which is probably a better idea. If you're familiar with the whites, whether it be like blue saddle mark racing homers, some of them have white bars. That would be one of the forms of opal generally. Recessive traits come in 2 forms. And I would say, well, let me go back to almond again. If you have an almond hen, all of her sons are going to be almond. If you have an almond cockbird, any color hen, the daughters are going to be almond, normal almond, and the sons are going to be almond with whatever the female carried. So she could be ash red. You can make your kite almond on an ash red. And you get these almonds where the flecking is red instead of black or white. My favorite one is to make an almond cockbird on a brown hen. And I've done that several times. And the babies come out, and you'll see some of the black ticking or kite ticking, and then they have brown flecking in there too. And with the darker brown color, the almond color in there, it's neat. It's like having a rainbow, a little plastic, all kinds of stuff is poking in there. The best model of that I ever saw was a Bokhara trumpeter that was raised by a guy in Bahrain by the name of Zuhair Haji. Zuhair is a top guy in Bokhara trumpeters. But he was smiling as he handed the bird. We were in India, and we were at one of the best breeders' houses there in India that were all gathering around and learning about the birds. It was kind of cool. He handed me this bird, and he smiled. He explained what this is. I looked at it and go, "Oh, wow, we got a rainbow." But it was a Bokhara trumpeter. It was almond split to brown. And it was just this beautiful, beautiful pigeon. And there is a tape of that somewhere that just shows me opening the wing of the Bokhara trumpeter, looking at it, looking up and explaining what it was. That can happen. It gets these multiple things. When you add genetic modifiers on things, you can create all sorts of different neat looking stuff.
Yeah, especially with a large bird like that, you have a nice palette to work with. A lot of color can be shown.
Oh, sure. And then the neat part is the whole group, Bob Nolan and I got invited to go to India. Zuhair invited us to go to judge the international show there, Thrissur in southern India. But man, those guys are doing it right. They're all enthusiastic, and Bob and I were the only gray birds in the mix. Everybody else was probably 40 or younger. And boy, they're just doing a storm up there with Jacobins and fantails and powders and croppers and everything. They're really enthusiastic. They got the pigeon clubs going. They're starting to do shows, and they get this amazing awards out. It's pretty cool stuff. But back to my genetic recessive traits. Sex-linked recessive is the next one I'll talk about a little bit. Sex-linked recessives are easy to track because the cockbirds could be split for it, and then the hens either are or aren't. So, for instance, there was Abraham Shazi. He lives in New Jersey, but he works out of Pennsylvania. He goes across the river to travel. But he was a native of Bahrain, came to the United States some years ago. But he created the reduced Jacobin. The very first one I ever saw was Dr. Shazi working with Modinas. He had a reduced Modena across it to Jacobin. And with the sex-linked recessive, basically the cockbirds carry it, and they throw daughters that either are or aren't. So the cockbird carrying two genes, one of them is the sex-linked part, and the other one is not. And so when they throw the one that is, whatever it is you're looking for, the sex-linked recessive, the daughters come that way. And the only way to get a cockbird in that color is have the mom the same thing too. So for instance, if you take, let me do it easier. Brown is a sex-linked recessive in pig. It's really easy. Brown, so you have a brown cockbird on a blue hen, for instance. That's sex-linked. All of the daughters from that mating are going to be brown, and all of the sons from that mating are going to be blue, carrying brown. Patterns in there, you can mess with that, add another bunch of stuff in. But the basic tour is that the father throws the genetic character, whatever it is, and then it meets the genetic stuff from the hen. They combine in the sons, but the father overlays, and the daughters always resemble whatever the father threw. And the sons always will carry both of what the father threw and what the mother. So the sons are always a combo because they carry two. And the daughters are always singular. In hemizygous, they only carry one gene per color. So in brown, for instance, you make those brown cockbird on a blue hen, you got brown hens, you got blue cockbirds carrying brown, color pattern in there, add that on, another thing to keep track of when you're doing it. But now those sons carrying brown, mated to a blue, will throw a blue daughter and a brown daughter sometimes. When the blue gene, blue wild type hits, it's going to be blue. When the brown hits, the daughter's going to be brown. In that same mating with a blue hen and a blue cockbird carrying brown, the sons are going to be 50-50. They're going to catch a blue from the mother, and either catch a blue from the dad or a brown from the dad. If the brown from the dad throws, the mother's blue overrides it. So those have blue carrying brown, but you don't know who they are. So you raise 4 babies. 2 of them are probably going to be carrying brown, and 2 of them are going to not be carrying brown, and you don't know. But the daughters are either brown or blue. So the sex linkage is always, you could tell from the father, the daughters will be whatever that sex-linked recessive is that the father is carrying. In Jacobins, for instance, yellow cockbird on the red hen, ash red, ash yellow on an ash red hen. The daughters are all going to be yellow, and the sons are all going to be red, carrying yellow. Every once in a while, they'll kick out, get that cockbird, that red cockbird carrying yellow on a red hen. Every once in a while, they'll kick out a yellow. Well, the yellow is always a hen. The blue's carrying brown, cockbird carrying brown on a blue hen. They throw a brown, it's going to be a hen. They will reduce cockbird on a blue hen that's not reduced. Any reduced they raise, it's going to be a hen. So these are tracking. That's why it's called sex linked, is that those are absolutely dependable.
That's probably the easiest way to determine the sex then of a young pair of birds, if you understand that side of it then.
Yeah, it's absolutely convenient though. It's like, if you're familiar with or can track them, your mind has, the ability to do 2 or 3 things at once. It's really easy to track if you know those patterns and you know the dominant recessive traits. You could do all kinds of extra things with them. Don't have access to that knowledge. They have something, well, what do I get when I make this or that? And they say, well, they just don't know because they don't have the background on it. And I'll tell you, I spend probably an hour or 2, sometimes 3 or 4 every day answering questions, some on the phone, some on the internet, some, just face to face. But generally, I just call Ron Davis, my friend in Oklahoma City, calls me this genetic guru. And I always visit with Ron and get calls from John Mankia or Jim Ecker and stuff. And we just have these wonderful visits over that. There's always, it can always start with, what am I going to get when? Or I raise this saying, how do you explain it? Generally, there's a wide variety of genetic stuff that can happen. Anyway. The straight recessive, now you have sex-linked recessive, which always will key off with the male carrying 2 genes. And he could throw daughters that are whatever that sex-linked recessive is. And the only way you get a son out of those that's the sex-linked recessive is to have the father throw it and the mother be it. And that's the only way. You get a cockbird that's brown, or a cockbird that is silver, or dilute. You get a cockbird that's yellow, or dun, or khaki, or reduced. They all had to have that same color as the mother. The mother had to be that too. And so that's how that works. But the mother always has to be the recessive trait as well to raise a son, a boy, male in that color. The autosomal recessive now are different in that both the mother and the father have to carry the recessive trait. So, for instance, I will take, pattern is autosomal. A bar to a check, you'll raise a check carrying bar. You raise a cockbird, a check carrying bar, but you also raise hens. Now, it's not related to color, so it's not on the X chromosome or that locus. So the females can carry 2 genes per pattern. So that is kind of challenging. So the female can carry 2, and the male can carry 2. And so you have a male is checker on both sides, and made it to a blue bar hen. All of the babies are going to be checker, all of them. The sons and the daughters are both going to carry barless, a bar. And so you can make 2 bars carrying barless together. And 1 out of 4, there's Mendel working on you again. You got white sweet peas and red sweet peas, or pink sweet peas, or tall sweet peas, or short sweet peas dwarfs. And anyway, you get them all crossed up, the hybrids, those in the middle, those half and half, throw stuff in a specific pattern. And throw one that's completely recessive, one that's completely dominant, and out of 4, you got 2 in the middle that are 1 of each. So out of 4 babies, you get 1 recessive, 1 dominant, and 2 dominant carrying recessive. That's how the mathematics work on that particular character. So your autosomal recessive then have to be mother and father. The autosomal recessive experience that I have, again, in Jacobins and Fantails, is milky. Milky is pretty cool. It has basically autosomal, and it has to appear in the homozygous state in both the male or the female to be milky. They can carry it, both the male and the female. But if you put 2, say a blue carrying milky hen on a blue carrying milky cockbird, there's a chance, 1 in 4, that you're going to get a milky, and it could be a boy or a girl, because this isn't sex linked. So the autosomal stuff, you have to get the gene from both parents, and the baby comes out, and it is generally 2 genetic characters instead of just 1. I think we got it. So we got the dominant characteristics. You got the codominant, which could be indigo or Andalusian, almond, opal, You have straight dominant characteristics, which could be like spread, that would be okay. The sex-linked recessives are things like lemon or extreme dilute, dilute itself. The color intensities, if you have, say, archangels, which come in intense, pale, dilute, and extreme dilute. So if you know Tim Caviglia in Minnesota, Tim has produced lemon or extreme dilute archangels. And this is really cool stuff. If you take a dominant, say a copper black-winged archangel, onto a lemon hen, all of those copper black-winged archangel younglings, the males carry lemon or extreme dilute. And if you put one of those onto a pail, the pail comes out where you can check the sons that are carrying, are pale, carrying extreme dilute. That's pretty cool. And then you can go with those pigs carrying extreme dilute and put them on a dilute. And the boys that are dilute out of that mating are carrying extreme dilute. So you don't have to test them. You can go 3 generations and never have to go back. You just go full speed ahead on that one. But it's kind of tricky. You have to know how it works. But you play them against each other and the dominance against the recessive. But if you know the patterns and the levels of dominant or recessive, you can play them back and forth across each other and have all kinds of fun producing stuff. Those are part of the things. So you have autosomal recessive, sex-linked recessive, and then pure co-dominant recessive, and then regular dominant recessive, or dominant not recessive. Did I confuse you yet?
Almost. I'm taking notes.
Okay. We tend to lose you. We go in, you'll say it once, and anybody who has a background in genetics will go through, oh yeah. We compare notes, we go up and explain. It's like we'll get finished, it's like, hey, too much detail, move on. It's kind of fun. Most people don't want to hear it, but all of a sudden, once in a while, it becomes useful to know that stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that way you're not rolling the dice every time, just a basic understanding, then doing it, and then really getting that knowledge set in stone.
And you watch the thing, I've had fancy pigeons my whole life. You talk to the guys that raise fancy pigeons, there's a whole bunch of genetic people in that mix. And they'll talk genetics, and there's some basic things that we all know. We know that 2 dominant colored pigeons, like 2 ice reds, for instance, they raise a yellow hen, it's a hen. And there's some basic stuff like that, but they're not too detailed. But anything like if you raise, a dilute out of a pair of intense, it's a hen. But those are kind of common knowledge that you have. If you bred pigeons for a while, that's the way it always is. Those things come up. But in the racing homer group, those guys, they're not into genetics as much as they're into the genetics that produce the best flying bird. So, really things like, for instance, in the show pigeons, the guys are going to refer to an ash red bar as a mealy, ash red bar as a mealy. You talk to the racing homer guys, they may refer to it as a silver, as a red barred silver. I was like, what? So actually, the genetic term would be a mealy or a ash red bar, and that would mealy. And the fancy pigeons and the racing homer guys could be a mealy or could be a red bar silver, depending on who you're talking to. But those are, they don't have the working genetics for color that the rest of us do. But they sure do have the working genetics on how to produce a bird that'll get home in a hurry. And I say, if you left that up to me, I'd be in big trouble. So I would definitely not be the one to, produce a racing homer for the homing instinct or the speed to get there. But you want to deal with raising colors, different colored ones? Call me.
So we got listener questions, and you covered the first one. Mason Hoots, he was asking for just a crash course. So I think we got that one covered there.
All right.
Another one was from Jake Kaiser. He said he is looking for information on producing clean tail mark with high quality color and fantails.
Guys that raise mark birds, and I raised saddles for a bunch of years and did pretty well with them. The key that comes from markings is that the tail mark and saddle and body mark, those are all markings that are just straight autosomal recessive, you hope. The idea is that they come close. Sometimes they're not marked perfectly. You'll come with say a tail mark with a few white feathers in the tail, or a saddle with too much color in it, say a black saddle in the wings, and it'll have a few tail feathers that are black as well, or sometimes even the whole tail. I think Leon Stevens has the best sense of this one. Leon and I have been friends for years, but he was making saddle fantails early on, and he was working on making the saddles, mating them to solid colors. Now, this will work for tail marks and body marks as well. So what you do is you take a marked bird and you mate it to a self-colored bird, a bird with no markings, so that you don't have to worry about it. the guys early on were making saddles, and they were thinking, well, this splash over here is almost a saddle. Then we made it to that. And it turns out splash is not anywhere near marking. It's just a splash. It doesn't have markings attached to it. And so you would just mess it up and it would be all over the place. If you raise nothing but splashes and you think, oh, what happened to the markings? And Leon, as they discovered that if you made them together, you get saddles most of the time. And if you made a saddle to a self-marked bird, a bird with no markings, other babies can, or maybe they do, maybe they don't have a white feather or here or two, but they will produce perfectly marked saddles out of a command together. That's that 1 and 4 thing again. Or if you made a saddle back to a bird carrying saddle, that's another way to advance the birds. You're safer doing it with, a saddle to a bird that's carrying saddle, or a bird with tail mark that's carrying tail mark. But the intensity, the color, you have to select for that. And, it's just, you got to keep the characters that are in there. The things that make the dark color in pigeons, you have something called sooty, which a lot of people, when you see a bar of a sooty, they think it's a checker, but it's not. It's a sooty. And if you look at the sooty feather and you look at a checker feather together, so if you went and you pulled a wing feather out of a racing homer, maybe a blue checker racing homer, and you pull a feather out of the wing shield of maybe a sooty jacobin, and you look at the feathers together, the sort of kind of look them next to each other. The checker one, if you look at it, it's going to have blue at the tip, or whatever the color is. That's what I call T-pattern. So the end of it, blue, and the part of the feather might be black, covering, that might be producing the checker. If you look at the Jacobin feather, if it's sooty, the sooty is going to be on the end of the feather too, as long as, and maybe up into the middle of the feather, and outside and away from the quill as well. And so you can tell sooty from checker just by looking at it. You know that the checker is actually going to have a blue tip on them. That's why they call them T-pattern checkers. Is that it comes in that way, and it's clean otherwise. Sooty is a mess. It's just it clutters stuff up. It really ruins the color on a blue, but it helps the color on a black or a red. The other one in there would be what they call between sooty, and then there's another darkening. I'm just going to get to the number of it. But the birds with black toenails and they come with black beaks, and that one's called dirty. So there's a genetic character we call dirty, which just makes everything dark. It just goes darker. So they generally have black toenails, dark color blue. Generally the beaks will go black as well. And you make sooty and dirty together, and you add any kind of bronze is about, I don't know, I won't say a number, but there's all kinds of numbers of bronzes. The teens are better, maybe 20s or 30s. But you add those kind of things, and those are all darkening factors. Grease quill is another darkening factor. Grease quill you'll see in a lot of the German color pigeons or the field pigeons. So it makes a beautiful dark color with the shine. You go to archangels. Archangels are most likely carrying something called grease quill. And if you open the wings, it's just this beautiful shine. The grease quill produces extra lanolin. And the lanolin is what produces the shine, the red and the green sheen on a pigeon. If you see those, that's the lanolin that's produced by the oil gland. But they also have grease quill, which if you look behind the leg under the hawk feathers, and you can pull them back, you can see feathers in there that are kind of yellow and clumpy around the middle of them. Those are birds with grease quill, and that grease quill makes them darker and shinier. I did that with Jacobins. I produced red and kite. I have two now. I have a red hen and a kite hen that I produced. They're both competitive Jacobins. The grease quill did not appear in Jacobins until I put it in there, as far as I know, except in Europe. It didn't exist here in the U.S. or North America that we know of. The birds are darker and they're shinier. And that's what grease quill did. In addition to the Jacobin Lebanon bronze, it just makes them super dark. But if you're going to raise bar-colored birds, you want the color lighter. Those things you don't want to have in the mix. You don't want sooty and dirty and bronze in your blues and your creams and your mealies, because it just makes them look gunky. But nice and clean, so you got to clear those out if you want a nice clean color in a bar pattern in the lighter version. Am I going anywhere that is of use to you?
I think that answers Jake's question. Go here. So Stephen Nusk says, I have a number of ash red pygmy powders that have deteriorating eye color, some very pale. The question is this possibly a genetic mutation, lack of rigid genetic pressure selection by the breeder, or some mutation coming from days of old?
I guess it's just you're going to keep track of it. And, if you want dominant characters with good dark eyes, you have to have birds with dominant good dark eyes. And you just keep going back to them. It would appear, that would be my guess. I can't name it out for sure. But like with the tail marks and the body marks, those are autosomal recessive traits, and they come back, and you just have to, have to keep track of them. You have to keep track of the birds that are carrying it, and you mate them back to birds that are perfectly marked. With the eyes, I'm not as familiar with the eye color in that because I haven't focused on that as much, but I do know that I was working with like red-eyed with dragoon, show racers, and dragoons have this beautiful dark red eye. I've seen Kuyu Yun show racers with this ruby red eye. It's beautiful. You see this blue show racing homer with a beautiful super dark red eye. And I know as soon as you cross into something else, that eye would go lighter. It was not as good as rich unless you made it two of them together or as close to that. Made them together, the eyes would continue to keep that concentration of color. The more you breed them, and if you're not paying attention to it, the lighter one shows up, and then the lighter one becomes the more frequently appearing individual. And so that just occurs. If you're not selecting for it, don't worry about it, disappears. Here's a sample of that. You guys, like 50 years ago, 60 years ago, you're thinking about a leghorn, white leghorn chicken. And they might go into an egg cycle and would produce maybe 20 eggs at a time. And they might hit an egg cycle maybe three times a year. So out of a white leghorn chicken, you might get like 60 eggs. And that was a lot of eggs, like years and years ago. And there's a place in Moorpark, California called Egg City. Egg City had a genetic breeding program there. One of them was producing leghorn chickens that laid more eggs. By selecting those chickens that lay more eggs, they were able to produce chickens which now can form and lay an egg in like 18 and a half hours. So you really have a chicken that lays an egg almost every day or more. And that's out of 50, 60 years of selective breeding. They've gone from 60, 70 eggs a year, something like that, to an egg every 19 hours. That's crazy. In the middle of all of that, they didn't pay attention to the attitude. And there's some crazy little chickens that lay a whole bunch of eggs. And so out of the middle of that, it's just a matter of if you're selecting breeding period, particular characteristic. If you focus on just one, other things will disappear or arrive depending on what you're not paying attention to. One of the major master breeders of Jacobins in my friendship circle is Clint Robertson. And he will have different characteristics, but I will mention his name only because there are like 100 different things you have to keep track of when you breed Jacobin. Clint is particularly good at making sure all of them arrive on the same pigeon. And that's, I got to keep track of 10 or 12 things, just like a Chinese juggler throwing balls into the air. The 2 is easy, 3 is harder, 5 is harder, 12 is harder yet. You can keep them all in here, but Clint is one of the, the few that I know that can keep so many of them, and his attention to detail. Sergio de Almeida was the same. He was really good at that. He had just tremendous roses on his birds. If you go to Jim Eckersby, you see great color on and thick manes on his birds. You go to different breeders that would say Bachman. Bachman would always have these they'd be smaller, but they'd be super smooth. You go to Louis Christner's house, and there would be all these beautiful Jacobins, and they all had just super top feather. And like each breeder basically might focus on the better bird, but then there would be 1 or 2 characteristics out of them that you would see, oh, wow, that's particularly that guy's focus. If you go to Ron Davis's, you're going to see birds that always show well. They've got great legs and they're always up in the air. And that's pretty cool stuff. The selective breeding process, when you're selecting for different things, you talk Charles Darwin is the mix. He's the one with all the genetic characteristics that we know about. And he's talking about selective breeding. You select particular characteristics that you breed for, and you just you bring them in and you select on that one thing, like the every 18 hours on the leghorn chickens, or a particular color characteristic, or a particular thing about the feet. You'll have stuff that shows up in the genetics, like webbed toes or crooked beaks or things like that. And then various breeds of pigeons are busy fighting those different things. In my own life, I did a number of experiments with crossing new things into my birds. I discovered a particular characteristic that was really important to the mix. That first cross that you make, like for instance, I had Jacobins, and some years ago, I created extreme dilute Jacobin. And so I had a relic yellow racing homer, extreme dilute racing homer that came from the original Barkle stock from South Africa. Well, the very first Jacobin I used to mate to that racing homer that carried, or was actually, extreme dilute, was the very best Jacobin hen I own. The best one. I say every single characteristic, she didn't have any flaws that were significant. But great qualities everywhere else. So all of the babies that came from that particular crowd lost all the Jacobin qualities, and the daughters were lemon, with a few little pieces of work. They look like the Leonardo that you see in Wendell Levi's book, called Leonardo, with that little crooked thing on the back of its head. The sons were carrying lemon. And so those sons, I put one of them right back on the mom, who was the very best Jacobin I had. And so those sons come back, and they almost have like almost cappuccino to them. They add a little bit more Jacobin, and they still could see the racing Homer. Funny thing with that racing Homer, they have a really neat eye. The eye is beautiful. It's sort of like a false pearl, but has a sort of luster look to it that's kind of neat. What I discovered in the mix is that eye carried through into generation 4 and 5. And if you look at the lemon Jacobins today, some of them still have that racing Homer eye from the very first cross. That was kind of cool to figure out. The birds that come back from the crosses, if the best bird you own was the first cross, there's no junk to come back when you raise youngsters out of those. So you keep going to the very best birds you have, and then all of a sudden at generation 4, Bob Vincent will refer to it as the explosion. Bob Vincent, our master breeder fantails in Tucson, Arizona. You know, Bob does a lot of work with genetics and fantails as well. But my experience was the same. At about generation 4, all the junk clears out, and you have this explosion that comes back. And sometimes those youngsters are better than the original first bird you used. That's crazy. But Ron Davis, when I was making browns, Ron Davis got birds at generation 4 that produced a hen that was the best opposite sex to the grand champion of the show at the Grand National Show in San Bernardino some years ago. And I'm just thinking, really? So what's that bird? Well, great-grandfather was a Norwich Cropper. I was like, what? So Norwich Cropper, so we got Brown to make Jacobins. John Brown Jacobins. That was kind of fun. Brown didn't exist in Jacobin. Milky Jacobins, that was autosomal. That's the hardest one I ever did. I didn't use the very best fantail to start it. I used the best Jacobin I could, but I used a fantail with soft, sort of soft, milky filled tail feathers, which was the absolute mistake because that kept with the program for 10 years. A lot of people just gave the color up because it wasn't useful. The feather was too soft, but that was my fault going in because I didn't use the best one going to start. Raphael Mace in France is breeding lavender Jacobins now. They're milky Jacobins, but those were produced by Jürgen Frey, a German guy, was involved in producing the barless Jacobins as well. But he used a really hard feathered milky. And so the babies that came out of that particular cross, you know, I don't give credit to Eugen Fry. He was really a special breeder of pigeons. And I have barless thanks to him and his nephew is Werner Reichel, who's one of the top German breeders of Shields and Jacobins as well. We learn some stuff from this genetic breeding. You know, like see something that you like and, you know, imagine that you could make the Jacobin in that color or something else with exactly the same thing. It's really cool. But all this genetic stuff, it's all out there, you know, working with the 3 basic colors, and everything else is a modifier, everything. And the modifiers are dominant, recessive, codominant, co-recessive, whatever. You just got your artist palette, and you just look out, and you just say, well, what do I want to put together? I've got all these choices. And so you start picking things out or selecting them out, and you zero in on a characteristic or 2 or 3 or 5 or 20. Go at it and breed some pigeons. And you watch these guys that have these wonderful rollers that fly, and the whole kit rolls at the same time. Well, that didn't happen by accident. Those were all bred that way. You look at Norwich Croppers or any of the Penny's got some beautiful Warbler Croppers I've seen the last couple of times. He's just amazing. He got his birds from Justin Robertson, I think, and Rick Burke. But man, those birds perform. They're hard, smooth feather. They blow. They come and talk to you. They're selected for their attitude, for the size and shape of the globe, for the color, the markings, and the feet and the legs, all the rest of the details of that. But you zero in on those things for your breed, and all kinds of great things happen. I saw a great Texas pioneer at the Youngbird show this summer for the Los Angeles Pigeon Club. John DeCarlo Jr. showed it. And I never held a bird in my hands that felt as massive and as big, double-breasted pigeon. I knew it was definitely a 200 pigeon. You couldn't hold it with one hand. It was too big. And it was just a remarkable pigeon. We were placed so high. I think it was the second or first bird in the show overall. It's like, man, there's characteristics. You select for them. Darwin was there. It was like survival of the fittest was one of his. Natural selection was one of his thoughts. And then selective breeding was the third most important theory that Darwin gave us that we used completely. survival of the fittest. You put regular common pigeons in a pen with all kinds of other stuff, fantails and Jacobins and Chinese owls and the rest, and just let them interbreed. And 10 years later, you're going to see a bunch of pigeons that look like the homers or the wild type that you started with. It's all going to revert to because that's the strength in that particular species of bird. But the selective breeding will produce all those recessive traits. And if you get the bronze and Modinas, look at those things. They are gifted with color, toy stencil, bronze, and Modinas. You see all kinds of stuff with those birds. But the round bodies, those were developed. But, you know, the colors all mutated out and you have individual things with each breed of bird.
And through selective breeding, like you were saying, it's racer guys are doing it for, you know, a different type of genetic that they're looking for. The roller guys getting their birds to do what they do. That's at the core of the pigeon fancy. You know, that's how we got so many different breeds, is through these genetic experiments.
You're right. When I talk breeding sometimes with my friend Paul Marini, he used to be the manager at the Palmetto Pigeon Plant, you know, where Wendell Levi basically started the place. But they were breeding Carnu, they were breeding other utility kings and utility homers, the crosses of all kinds of things. But the thing they were specifically genetically producing was birds that could have a whole bunch of babies that had a weight somewhere between 8 and 16 ounces, somewhere between 12 and 16, but they would produce as many babies as they could that had this certain range of the weight the babies would weigh cleaned out and dressed out, basically. And I was like, whoa, I have birds that were raising 18 babies a year. You know, even the pairs, and they would select for that particular characteristic, which was they raised a whole bunch of babies. And so they had this line of birds that was the best in the world at producing squabs to eat. And I was like, whoa. And then you see, like Sergio De Almeida, he's one of the top Jacobin breeders I've ever met in my life. But man, he was just doing all kinds of things with those birds every year. Would produce better and better and better. And his birds had always these perfect roses, always perfect roses. They were big, they were showy, but there were certain characteristics on his birds that were absolutely perfect. And his eye, you know, basically zeroed in on that. And so selectively bred for those. And they always came true. They always bred true to that as well. You get birds of him, you knew they were always going to have good roses.
I wanted to ask, are you going to be able to make it to the NPA Grand National in Oklahoma coming up soon?
My intention is to be at Oklahoma. I do have an engagement, and I'm going to be judging the British Jacobin Society show in Darlington, Great Britain, first weekend of January. And we'll go back from there and hopefully rest up. We'll make it to the national following that, I think.
We'll hope to see you there. If anybody wants to see, Drew does have some YouTube videos. You can just search his name and you can hear him talking on a variety of things, on genetics, on Jacobins, on breeding. Really, really good stuff there too. So this has been awesome. This is definitely one of the episodes that you're going to have to listen to a couple times with a pen and pad in your hand and answer your questions as you listen to it.
I do. There's about 3 or 4 videos posted on YouTube. If you just push my name in there, Drew Lobenstein, and there's a lemon #1 and #2. I did a lecture at the Los Angeles Pigeon Club, which Shahid videotaped. This was several years ago now, but I took a look at that thing. There's like 50,000 hits on that thing. I thought, where are there 50,000 people who would watch a video about pigeons? But it was kind of cool. There's one I just on basic genetics, and I have different birds and breeds, and I'll show you the birds. And then the Jacobins, particularly, are focused on one, but the Jacobin lemon #2 is a pretty good discussion about Jacobins and the parts on it, and how you can watch the generations in there too, from generation 1, cross 2, 3, 4, so you get the color, and then you add Jacobin parts to it. It takes about 4 generations to do that. But anything else the same, you know, but yeah, watch the videos. I get a lot of comments about that.
Well, thanks for coming on and sharing your information and your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate being able to share. You know, if I don't share, you know, a lot of breeders and pigeon guys would, you know, not share any of their secrets. I don't know that these are secret, but, you know, if I'm not here, we get the information, where would you get it if it dies with me? Paul McNorton was a great teacher about pigeons. He lives in me. You know, every time I go, I'm talking to him all the time because a lot of great knowledge he expressed and shared with me when I was a kid growing up. But the pigeon guys out there, visit with them, share your time, and Taylor, it's a social group. They're great people here. And we all have this passion for pigeons, which has come from thousands and thousands of years of keeping them. Anyway, thanks, Phil, for the chance to be with you.
Color genetics is one of those areas that really shows just how deep the rabbit hole can go when it comes to pigeons. Pigeons are not just studied and bred, they're also shared, documented, and brought to life in other ways. So from the science behind these birds, let's get into how their stories are told. Here is a conversation with pigeon documentary maker Jim Jenner.
Today we have with us Pack Films writer-director Jim Jenner. He was born in Seattle and began writing professionally at the age of 18 for South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. He joined the Bureau of CBS News there in 1970 and worked throughout Asia and the USA until he returned to his native Northwest and founded his own television production company in 1976. He eventually sold the 60-employee film in 1993. Jim then concentrated on producing independent films, including an award-winning series on Route 66 and documentaries and instructional works on pigeons. He is recognized globally as an articulate advocate that domestic pigeon keeping has a positive effect on individuals, especially children. He also continues to create films for corporations and associations, and recently completed a documentary film for PBS, Saving the Berg, which chronicles the rebirth of his hometown in Phillipsburg, Montana. Thanks for coming on and talking with us today, Jim.
You bet, Philip. Glad to be here.
You have a lot of different movies about pigeons, and that's why we were bringing you on here today. First question I got, what sparked your interest in pigeons as a documentary subject?
Well, they'd always been part of my life. I stumbled into when I was a little boy, we moved into the city and I got hooked up with a bunch of kids that were catching street birds, bigger, older, tougher than me and good guys. And that it made me very fond of the birds. And then over time, as you heard from my bio, I ended up with a film production company. So I decided I really wanted to do the one thing that I wanted to do a story about the homing pigeons and the history and how they had been important in war and how magical they were as a racer. And I took that childhood interest and the fact that I had a production company and got going on. And there's some wonderful accidents in it too. But I did that in 88 and 89. And then I think it came out in 1990.
So I guess that kind of answers then your background with pigeons there.
Yeah, I think the one thing I have in my generation, and I'm 74, when I was a young man, we were allowed to wander and we were allowed to go explore and ride our bikes and come back, only when our mothers yelled when it was dark. It's a different era now. I mean, children are not allowed to do any of those kinds of things. And I was 10, 11 years old on Skid Row in downtown Seattle, trying to catch pigeons right next to guys who were passed out from drinking too much wine. So, I mean, it was a really interesting kind of a childhood people they don't understand. And then what happened with many of us is we went to the one thing there wasn't any Google, there wasn't anything else. You went to this huge brick building and had to go in and ask usually a lady, as to, where are the books on pigeons? And that's when you start to realize, you go into the library and now there was these stories about these military birds that had carried messages when they were shot up, and racing birds. And it's like the curtain goes up on a fascinating world compared to the poor little things you're catching on the street.
So how many films have you made to date?
Oh, Philip, I'm sorry. I think it's pigeons. I think it's 12 or 13, maybe. I've been in the production business, long enough to forget most of the things I've done.
So do you have a favorite of the films that you've made? Have any of those stick out to you?
Well, I don't know. You've got kids. Like, so I'd asking which is your favorite. The one that it always the classic line, "You never forget your first." I mean, it's the wonderful thing about my decision to make a film in '88 was I had built a production company that was a good sized production company. We were doing lots and lots of television advertising and corporate work and everything. And it was a big enough company that I had some free time and I had some money. And so I decided to do my instead of a novel, writing a novel, I wanted to do a documentary, and I called it Marathon in the Sky. And so I started working on it, and I built a loft. I found birds. I joined it. I knew pigeon guys around me. I built a loft specifically to be able to do some video of the lifestyle of the birds, egg laying, rearing, and all that. And one time I had a chance. I had a good sized business, and we were at an auction, a big charity auction, and somebody said, "Well, here the Weyerhaeuser Company has this wonderful Bell Jet Ranger helicopter, and they're going to take you on a tour of all of their tree farms." who wants to bid on this tour? And it's a 4-hour tour. And a Bell Jet Ranger at that time would go for probably $1,800 to $2,000 an hour. So I got it. I got 4 hours with this Bell Jet Ranger for about $1,000, I think. And then I had to call the pilot and say, no, I don't want to go to the any tree farms. I'd like to follow some pigeons from one small airport to another airport. And the guy, his name was Jess Hagerman, and he was the Weyerhaeuser corporate pilot. You can imagine what a good pilot he was. And he had a friend of mine who was a marvelous aerial, a great filmmaker, Doug Kahn. We then talked to some friends of mine from Tacoma, Washington, who were training pigeons. They took about 500 birds down to a little airport in Centralia. We knew what they were doing. We were in a helicopter. They let these birds go. And honest to God, I had not had any idea whether the birds would go in 100 different directions or whatever. I had experiences with fixed wing where it was really hard to get birds in flight. We were in the air with some very, very good lenses, and we were realizing, my goodness, these birds don't care about this helicopter. And there's some shots in there, and this is old stuff. It's, you know, the ratio, it's not widescreen or anything, but we had some images where I think 1 and 2 birds are filling the frame. And so that's pretty close to birds in flight. And so we ended up with this marvelous stuff with this wonderful helicopter guy who was just, you know, he went out there to chase pigeons around, but he didn't care. And then I showed that film as a preliminary to a bunch of people at the American Racing Pigeon Union. They had a convention, I think it was in maybe in Milwaukee, and I showed it. And a guy came up to me and said, "Hey, you got to show that stuff to Michael Landon." And, you know, I thought he had been drinking or so. I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, "Why?" He said, no. He's working on a film about, he's bought the rights to that book Where Pigeons Go to Die. He's doing a film down in Kansas. And I think he's been having trouble getting aerial shots. So I kind of wrote it off. And I went home and back to the office, la. And no kidding, within a week, I came back from lunch one day, and the receptionist says, "You just got a call from Michael Landon. I mean, the real Michael Landon, Little Joe." And so I called him back, and we basically agreed. He was very interested in what we shot, and I said, "Well, I'm going to be in Los Angeles doing some work on the big pigeon race they have down there." And he said, "Great, come to my office. We'll take a look." And that's what we did. And Doug Kahn, who's actually helped me with the film, he was there too. And here I'm sitting with Michael Landon, and he and his producer are looking, and they're saying, yeah, we can use that. And, oh, great, we'll use that. Oh, that's a nice shot. Yeah, we'll use that. And he's talking about an NBC movie of the week that he's working on. He doesn't have footage that he thinks is going to work. I think he said, well, we'll pay you a top market rate, which I think was about $75 a second at the time. And I had the foresight to say, well, I don't want to sell it. Why don't you just narrate my documentary and we'll call it good?
Nice.
And that's what happened. And really tragically, I was going to work with him. I was going to sit down with him and go in the audio studio. He got sick and he wasn't well. And then he called back and he said, "I can't come. Can we patch this? You sit in the studio up there. I'll sit down here." And he did an absolutely brilliant job reading, basically asking me what the scenes were rather than being able to look at the footage. And then I think within 14 months, he'd passed away. He had pancreatic cancer at the time he narrated that film. And so it was the last documentary he ever narrated. But it was the most wonderful kind of, here's this, this major star, and he did a beautiful job on it. He was very sensitive to what was going on. So Marathon in the Sky, in terms of all the serendipitous things that have happened to me in the pigeon world, has to be number one, just for the fact that, it was, nobody in the pigeon world really knew me, not in the racing world. And so all of a sudden, here comes this 1-hour movie narrated by one of the top guys on television. And the pigeon world, I became a rock star, I mean, overnight. And it was, and I got involved a lot with some of the pigeon efforts, the Pigeon Museum and other things. But that will always be a pretty special film because a number of the people that I asked to be part of it, particularly in England, I asked people that they didn't know me, and I had a fellow named Frank Tasker, one of the best pigeon men I've ever known in my life, took a shine to me and got doors to open that, in most cases wouldn't open. So we were able to do kind of an inside story that was it was not only had some of the best people in the world in the story, in the history of it, but it also had this wonderful aerial footage that was at the time was unprecedented. People hadn't seen it before. And so that's always one of the kind of a benchmark of how it was just a really, really odd situation where I had the equipment, I had the time, I had the resources. And then from my childhood, I had the passion. I wanted to, it was a story that I wanted to tell because anybody who loves pigeons has got a chip on their shoulder from all the baloney we've had to take about, what they do. People have completely gotten away from the fact that, why are pigeons in so much great art? Why do people like the Queen of England and Picasso and all these people have loved pigeons? It wasn't because they were worried about, a little pigeon poop on their shoe. And I've tried to advocate that we need to realize that love is worth protecting, particularly with kids. It's just I have to say this, Philip, that when I did a film called Young Wings, which I was trying to explain the impact on children, and I'm talking about kids in a youth prison, kids in different parts of the world. I mean, we shot it in Belgium and England and China and a bunch of places like that. When you are able to point out to people that folks that have been involved with pigeons, particularly as children, in almost all cases have turned out okay. And that film, Young Wings, has the last episode is I'm the only white guy in the backyards in South Central LA with a bunch of roller guys, all these wonderful young black guys who are all into pigeons. And we're talking, kind of present day. And in the film we shot, one guy said, well, I said, do you go to a lot of these things? Oh, I go to all of them. I go to the car things and I go to this, but the pigeon things I like because there's never any trouble with the pigeon thing.
Yeah.
And what he was talking about, and I met guys who literally one child in the family that had been associated with pigeons was the one that was okay, the one that wasn't doing a hard time. So that's the passion is when you get something that affects you as a little kid, you don't, and I don't know if you've had that experience. I know you're giving that experience to your own children. It's profound. It's so important. I live in a beautiful part of Montana, and the most relaxing thing I can do is go out and catch a beautiful fish and then put it back. I mean, there's certain things you do that connect you to the world, and watching a bird lay eggs and waiting 17 days for them to hatch, and then seeing whether this pair that you put together produce anything that can figure out how to get home in a hurry. That's all magical.
No, that's great too, especially with teachers. Like I said, I encourage teachers to show these documentaries, especially the Young Wings, Share the Blue Sky, Oldest Feather Friend, just the really kind of icebreakers and eye openers of why do they have such a bad rap. When you hear about this history, it's always shocking to people.
Oh yeah, and the bad rap. I mean, it as much as I've always laughed at his stuff, I would love to. Woody Allen did more harm with one joke with calling rats with wings than any single person I know of. And then the other thing that's happened is people make a fortune exterminating pigeons. Oh, excuse me. No, they can't exterminate them because this species is so effective and so good at staying alive that they keep coming back. So that it's for exterminators, it's the gift that keeps on giving. So those are the guys that are out there. There was a guy on a show called Dirty Jobs.
Yeah.
May he burn in hell. I mean, the show he did was ridiculous about the disease. He interviews some exterminator saying, oh yeah, there's 30 diseases you can get from pigeons. That's why we got to get rid of these things. They're talking about an animal that arguably has been domesticated longer than dogs.
Right.
There is evidence in the caves along the Mediterranean that people were living with and domesticating, not just eating, that they had them as pets before the wolves came in to be warm and be subservient to us. So it's funny to watch how crazy society is about something as simple as what we all know as the bird of peace, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Literally going from the bird of peace to this. I mean, that's pest control companies. It's a service that they've made money on. They're not going to stop doing it. And they can dump all the bad press. Pigeons don't really have lobbyists. I mean, these kind of movies like this, and, we try to raise awareness whenever we can too. And
Well, we need to be practical. I mean, the thing, my favorite thing I saw one time was in Ball, Switzerland. And the Swiss are pretty good at figuring things out. They basically have official places where the town's pigeons can nest in the tops of churches. It's a story that's in one of the ones that's Share the Blue Sky. What they've done is they've made it where these birds come in and they nest, and then they go take every other egg. So they have enough pigeons in the city that some little old lady that really wants to, throw out some grain can do that in a designated park. There's only so many, but there aren't flocks and flocks of pigeons that haven't had enough to eat and all that. It's interesting how everybody's approach to it. The fact domestic pigeons moved out into society and are able to survive is the same thing that happened with domestic cats. I mean, there's more feral cats out there probably in the world than there are the feral pigeons in a way. And they're a lot more dangerous from a health standpoint. But all these things have happened, and it just comes back to our poor hobby where you can't people, oh, you can't have those in your backyard. There's all kinds of disease, and people legislate against it. It's terrible. And it's sometimes society's changed. I mean, we in the West are doing it less with, we have less connection with nature. But, Mexico, parts of Eastern Europe, I mean, pigeon racing is huge. And I can't tell you how big it is in Japan, in China. I mean, I went over there to make a movie in 2002, and I thought I knew something about what was going on in the world of pigeons, and
they're the ones who just broke the record, I think, for the highest sold pigeon. It was a year or so ago.
yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Well, they love to do that. They love to do that, and it's a very interesting phenomenon because they're not doing that to sell the birds. You never see, somebody that's a Barcelona winner or whatever. I mean, half the time they're doing it. It's one millionaire outbidding another millionaire, and then the birds go into a loft and everybody forgets they're there. Seriously, they have a very interesting approach, and the way they race and everything. They finally are, they used to during the real communist era, the Mao's time, they would send them 2,000 miles away and see if they ever came home. So you didn't need any clocks or anything. If you'd win a race by a week, what I mean?
So, I mean, you're definitely promoting the hobby and kind of raising awareness about it. So, have you ever encountered any surprising little known facts about pigeons when you were doing your research and filming these documentaries?
Where to begin. I mean, I think people forget how, I mean, we got something that's got a brain the size of your little fingernail, and we don't allow ourselves to realize how intelligent they really are. I mean, a chicken, comes out of the egg, and it practically has a driver's license from the time it's hatched because they're fully formed. They can feed themselves and everything. Pigeons really need another 3 weeks, like our babies do, before they're really ready for prime time. And that's because there's so much development going on after they come out of the egg. One of my favorite stories was when I was doing Oldest Feathered Friend. I went to Boston. I went to Harvard because somebody told me about they had pigeons that they used in the lab there, and they had told them I was doing a thing about birds in the lab, and I wasn't trying to be an animal rights person or anything else, and I had some cred with the other stuff I'd done, or somebody introduced me. I went in there and I met these guys, and met some of their birds, and they had pigeons and other animals. But the guy told me a story that I thought was the most fascinating of all, was that this young student had bought a lot of these pigeons that were now 7 or 8 years old in their little area there. They all had their own little nice area their pen. He designed this system where they would peck, and if they saw two things, a pair of something that came up maybe a minute later or 2 minutes later that they'd seen before, if they pecked the right colored light, they'd get a grain. I mean, I'm not talking about fed. I mean, like one piece of corn. So they a picture of the two little screens, a picture of a pipe and a top hat, picture of a chair and a car, picture of this and this, and then if the pipe and the top hat come up again, bingo bango. They were able to remember 300 different pairings, all of them. Not, and some of them were even better than that. 300 different pairings that they'd seen before, almost instantly to get one grain. That's not the only story. This guy, he's obviously a smart scientist. He built this as a student. He graduates. He ends up going out to California and he becomes a full-blown professor. And he's invited to come back to Harvard to lecture on something. This is maybe 5 years later. He comes back to Harvard and he goes to visit his old friends in the lab and he realizes all of his old equipment is in this storage room and a bunch of his pigeons are still there. So he pulls the stuff out, fires it up again, plugs it in, makes sure it works, goes and gets the birds, puts these birds in he hasn't seen them for years, puts them back in there, and they remembered every single pair they'd remembered before.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. We've talked to some professors who's done different work with them and their intelligence level, and that's impressive on the memory side of it too.
And so it's just one of those. That's I could go on and on and on about. I mean, some of my there's so many favorite stories of people and pigeons, and particularly like little kids or, some. I was amazed as a little boy to start to read. It really helped me. I grew up in a family. My dad worked for a bank. I mean, we weren't really wealthy or anything. But when I got into that world of pigeons, and I realized that there was a lot of real basic guys, a lot of blue collar guys that were in it, as well as really wealthy guys. And some of my favorite remembrances are going. There's one famous guy in the Seattle area. He just won a big race called the Puget Sound Futurity, which would be maybe 1,000 birds, and he might have won $2,000 or something. It was back in the 60s. We're talking real. This is a big deal. And I got on the bus and went to visit this guy, and his daughter and his wife were very, very pleasant to me. I was probably 11 or something. I'd gone all the way in the bus, and it was like almost an hour ride. And then he said, well, you want to go out and see the pigeons? So, okay, he takes me out one-on-one out to the pigeon loft. This guy was a taxi driver. And Philip, probably every third, maybe I'm being generous, maybe fourth or fifth word was an F-bomb about this or this or this or this. And I've never been around anybody that had, had butchered the language quite like that. And I had this experience at the age of 11 of sitting there and thinking, okay, now this guy, look at all these beautiful birds, look at all the awards he's won. And I kind of was able to have that epiphany of, he may not be speaking in language that I think is appropriate, but I need to get to know this person. I need to listen and I need to, not write him off because there's a lot to offer here. And I will never forget that moment of realizing, boy, my parents would be shocked if they knew I was listening to this. And then I thought, well, what the heck? You want to pick up this F and so or this? Yeah, sure, I do. And I want to find out, what did you feed it before you shipped it, and what were its parents like, and all that. Those experiences that any kid that wants to learn about animals or from somebody who's an expert, that kind of, you have to take into consideration that you have to learn, you have to shut up, and you have to really learn to respect the person for not what they say, not necessarily what they wear or anything, but what's in their head. And some of those kinds of memories are so strong with me, as much as meeting all these guys that won big races and the other stuff. The childhood stuff, I think, is probably always the strongest.
So we kind of touched on this. I mean, like, what role do you see your films playing in conservation efforts or changing public perceptions of pigeons? Is that kind of your focus, is to kind of just wake people up to the big history they have, or are you encouraging specific parts of the hobby?
Well, it's a little hard because the hobbies it changes so much in terms of the racing world is being changed by just people can't have backyard anything anymore. So what you could do in the 50s and 60s is not possible. There's other interests. I guess I did the movie so that people would understand, hey, give these poor creatures, these beautiful creatures, some credit. And Marathon in the Sky was this marvelous story. I mean, the swelling music at the end when these birds are coming home after, and here's your bird that you raised, from an egg, and it's 2 years later, and here it comes, and you just know, looking in the sky based on talking to your buddies around you on the phone, that what you're looking at is a winner coming in that you created, that you helped make it the winner that it is, physically and everything else. That kind of emotion, that emotional thing is what I've always tried to have people understand. That's the racing side. At the same time, doing things about shows, and you see guys that have that same look when they've entered a bird, and they've had their bird in there with 12 or 18 other birds, and all of a sudden,
Right.
they are the grand champion. That's the same kind of moment that I think people are always looking for in any kind of a hobby. Obviously, pigeons are not for everybody, but it's so hard to say that anything that I've done over the last 40 years is current today, because situations change. And I do know that there's one thing that will not change, and that is, I have hundreds of times in my life, I have seen a child look at this bird for the first time and watched, particularly when they understand they have to be gentle. We're talking about changing your behavior, because pigeons and horses, anything with its eyes on the side of its head, that's a prey animal. It thinks something's going to kill it every second of the day. So it's all ready to be spooked. And when you, as a child or even an adult, can make that bird, and the same with a horse, when you can make it, when you can be calm enough that you can pick it up, that you can react to it, and it doesn't fly around and they don't all, explode around you because they're so afraid of you, that changes you as a person. That makes you a different person. And I've seen it. That's, I think, one of the reasons why the pigeon guys, like they say, oh yeah, the pigeon guys were always okay. Those brothers doing hard times for murder, but the pigeon guys were okay. That connect, and I'm not kidding. You take Mike Tyson, okay? Now Mike had a rough time after becoming a champion. He was so abused by the people, his advisors and everything else. Mike Tyson's first fight was on the rooftop in Bedford-Stuyvesant, when the neighborhood bully asked to see his favorite pigeon,
Yeah.
and pulled its head off. And Mike Tyson won that fight that day and didn't lose a fight for 20 years. With all the things that have happened in his life, I think he's finally married a gal that, he deserves, and deserves him or whatever. What's he gone back to? He's got pigeons again. And he came to a pigeon show in LA. Some friends were telling me he told them they'd be there for an hour. And he came back for several days in a row and made friends with everybody and wanted to see everybody's pigeon. And he wasn't the heavyweight champ. He was Mike Tyson, this little pigeon kid from, really the toughest neighborhood in New York. And those stories, when you think about, this little bird having that effect on people, I've always felt good about advocating for that, no matter what. And the things about disease and other stuff, I mean, I personally have an allergy that's very rare, but I can't be around them because of the dander that's on their feathers, and that's unfortunate. But the whole idea that there's so many diseases is just, in this very antiseptic society, it's become a crucible that it's very hard to overcome. And it's very hard to overcome with parents who, the hovercraft parents that don't want the kids to do anything. I've had several instances where the kids were dying to have pigeons, and the moms were like, nope, no, they can't do that.
The lessons that you can teach a kid with pigeons are the same lessons that you can teach a kid if you're living on a farm with cows and sheep, but they're much cheaper. You got to clean water, clean food, stay on schedule with it, take care of it, and it's not going to break the bank. You don't need 20 acres of land. You can do all this in a tiny backyard. You could just do it as a pigeon, as a house pet too.
You also have the accelerated generational thing, that, I mean, that when in a couple of years as a child, my kids or your kids, they see a baby that they saw come out of the egg, and then it becomes a teenager, and then it gets married, and then it has a family right in front of them, and they see 2 or 3 generations. And that's why Darwin worked with pigeons, because he could look at 3 or 4 or 5 generations in in
Right. Yeah.
2.5 years. And so to look at, I went to Downhouse and where he did his experiments, and they've got some stuffed birds there that are, it's one of the films we did. And there's one that looks, the front end looks a little like a roller, and the back end is a half of a fantail. I think the wings were droop wings. And anyway, so you're looking at one of the ones that Darwin created, right? There was this kind of blend of these different things. And then when they kept putting they put different breeds together, within 3 generations, they all came back and
Yeah.
looked like a rock dove. He could breed them that quickly in his backyard, just like you said. It's, you're not, the pigeon stuff is fun because it is something that's in your backyard. It's at home. It does get you out. I mean, you go to visit other people, but the other thing, that the most marvelous part of the racing world, and for roller guys too, but for the racing guys is, I mean, you send something a long ways away, and you sit there thinking, okay, all the whether this thing's coming back or not, and how fast is all on me. How I treated it, how I bred it, how I raised it, how much fresh air it had, how I trained it. Did I make it want to come here? Did I make it comfortable here? Did I make it love this place so it's going to go faster than those other guys? And when you see something coming out of the sky that, if you talk to your buddies on the phone, and everybody's on their cell phone now, but back in the day, it used to be, my mom yelling out the window, well, he said he let it go. That's epic. And that's just, you can't, I don't care what they say. You're not going to get any video game that gives you that real kind of satisfaction of watching that dot become, something that hits the landing board.
That's the moment right there. That's why they do everything. That's why they get up and feed every day and water that. Yeah, when that bird comes back from a race, that's it right there. That's pinnacle.
Yeah, and it is a beautiful thing. It is just like horse racing, or just like anything where you get, a lot of people involved in the competitive nature, and you get a lot of money involved. And that's really what's sadly happening with the Chinese market. Made Europe go nuts. I mean, what made Belgium and all those places just go, holy cow, this, I'm making millions of dollars selling these things, and nobody even knows I've got the cash. I mean, it was that became the whole idea of how much money birds are worth is, in a way, is laughable. I don't know, you're not a racing guy, but the secrets of champions, the underlying point of the whole thing, over and over and over again, is don't believe the BS. Is don't believe somebody that tells you they got the greatest and this and that. It's all these guys who are bona fide, rock hard champions of champions, for generations, telling you, yep, you don't need to do that. You need to do this and this and this, and keep your eye out for this, and this. And that's what I loved about that series, because it was the antithesis of all the big money guys and, oh, you got to do this. And, I loved it when guys would call me, oh, I'm so and so, so and so. You probably heard about me. And I was hoping, I think you got to do a film about me. And I would enjoy telling them, well, I don't think that's going to make our schedule, because the real guys, the really men and women that are very, very good at this game, tend to be rare people with stock sense. And that's something it's the same with people with horses. It's the same with people with they've got just some kind of way of mentally connecting and understanding the creature that they're dealing with. And it's beautiful to watch. I mean, it's not, I wrote a book about it, and I'd love to tell you some other, it's called The Featherhood. And I tried in that book to do two things. One is I tried to explain how certain people in certain parts of the world, like guys I met in Belgium, they could look at 100 pigeons in a loft and tell you, I want that one, and I think that one over there. And they would be able to somehow sense what was going on, unlike anybody I'd ever seen. And they maybe second or third generation. I did this story because it's about guys like that. At the same time, it's about a bunch of inner city kids that find this phenomenally valuable bird that's escaped. It's just one of those stories that I based it on everybody that I've met in doing pigeon stories all over the world. The millionaire guys and the street kids like me. and it all comes to an end as far as a big race, and it's set in Tacoma, Washington. And but one of the things I did that for was that there would be something that for kids they could read it and really start to understand what's going on in the bird's head. That was the most fun for me, was trying to write about what the bird was thinking without it being anthropomorphic, which means without me making it have human traits. And in some of the reviews, my favorite reviews were from some pigeon, a couple, particularly in England, and they've got some wonderful writers. The guys that they write a lot. Was that I had made it where I did not anthropomorphize, and it helped them to even understand kind of what the birds were thinking. That was fun to try to do that. Every one of these films I've done it's got its own story, so there's just no way to know where to.
No, yeah, well, let's do that. Let's set up another time, and we'll talk about the book, The Featherhood. We're up against the clock on this one. So any members of the AU members can watch his films on the AU website, and that's free if they're AU members. Is that right?
Yep, and they have to check with the national office. There's a password. I wish I knew it, but they can check, and then and that's the documentaries as well as and frankly, I think a lot of guys that particularly if you're new to the sport, if somebody's listening to you is probably looking for any information they can find. The one thing about Secrets of Champions, I will tell you, is that several of the guys have passed away, but they were some of the greatest. And I was the guy that got to decide who was in it. I mean, nobody paid me, nobody, and there's plenty of people out there getting paid to make racing guys famous because the money's there. These were all, a couple of them were guys that I couldn't even believe they'd agreed to be in it. They didn't need it. And it said a marvelous guy in Ireland named Ronnie Williamson, probably the greatest racer in the world, at least when we did this. And couple of English guys, and then a marvelous guy in Holland. And then the series expanded, and we visited Germany and Poland and all kinds of places to show what was going on in the world. But that Secrets of Champions is one of the things that's probably for an AU member a really good way of looking about housing and feeding. And there's one film that's on pigeon lofts. I think it's 3 hours long. I mean, you got to really like pigeon lofts to want to watch that one.
You touch on a lot of different aspects of it. There's definitely a lot of good racing stuff. And then pigeonfilms.com is another way that you can watch your films.
Yeah, well, you can buy them, and then you can get them online. In other words, you watch them, you stream them, and they're not, there's nothing that's on the 2024 Barcelona race. I mean, the last one we did, I think, was in 2016. The one about Spring Hill is pretty interesting. That's Secrets of Champions 7. That's got an awful lot of stuff that people might find interesting, because that's some of the best guys in the world that all have gone down to Florida to race against each other.
First off, thanks for all your efforts in promoting the hobby with these films. That's terrific, and I'm sure it's helping a lot of people get in it and getting better at it. And thanks for coming on and talking with us today.
Well, Philip, I'm glad you're doing well, and you're getting so many episodes under your belt. I'm proud to be part of it. So hope we can do it again.
That was a really fun conversation with Jim. His pigeon documentaries are awesome. So if you get a chance to check them out, definitely do it. Now, as much as we all enjoy the hobby, there are also a few important things to be aware of as pigeon keepers. So let's get into the next conversation, all about pigeon lung. We have with us Dr. Erica Herzog. She got her undergraduate medical degree from UNC Chapel Hill and is currently practicing as a pneumologist at Yale School of Medicine in New Haven, Connecticut. So, Erica, thanks so much for coming on and informing us on this pigeon lung situation.
Oh, well, thank you so much for asking me.
So for those who may not have heard about it, can you explain what pigeon lung is and how it affects the lungs?
Sure. So pigeon lung is a type of allergic reaction that develops in the lung. And what happens is people will breathe in something produced by their bird that gets kind of trapped in the lung. Your immune system recognizes it and tries to clear it, but can't. And as a result, patients start experiencing cough and shortness of breath that might let them know that they're having a problem.
Are those kind of the first onset of symptoms, would be like you're saying, shortness of breath and coughing?
In most patients, yes. Most of the time, it will be what we call subacute or chronic onset, where you might first notice that you're coughing and then might notice that you're short of breath when you're walking around or maybe exerting yourself. Very rarely, people might get very sick to the point where the first thing that they notice is that they think that they have pneumonia because they're so short of breath and feeling unwell. But that's a rarity. Most of the time, it's this chronic, slow developing cough and shortness of breath.
And if it goes untreated, how severe can it get? You said it could even feel like pneumonia.
Yes, well, so in the subacute chronic type, if it goes on for months to sometimes years, the lungs can start developing a scar, and that means that they're beginning to solidify. And so after a period of time, the lungs might get to the point where you can no longer breathe and you need a lung transplant.
You're saying it's almost like an allergic reaction. So is this something that develops from, you've just been around it for a really long time? Who's more at risk of developing? Someone who's around it a bunch, or is it? I've even heard some people say that. So let's say there's two pigeon fanciers, one of them gets it really bad and the other one doesn't, and it's a genetic. Could that be the case too, or is it just exposure?
It's probably somewhere between the two. So that's a really excellent question that you're asking. Unfortunately, we don't fully understand why some people will develop pigeon lung and some people won't, even though they have the same amount of pigeon exposure. That's made the medical community believe that there is a genetic component, meaning that there's something about a group of patients that they're more susceptible, either because of something intrinsic to their lung or something about their immune system. They just respond to the pigeons in such a way that they develop this type of reaction and this lung problem. And other people who don't have that genetic problem or that genetic change are not susceptible, but we don't know what those genes are. And so at this point, that's still a guess.
So going back to like talking about allergens, what is it inside? The dust, the air, is it coming from like the droppings? Is it that dust that comes off of the feathers? What is it that's getting in and irritating the lungs?
So that's not known. You've already mentioned a couple of things that are believed to be causing the pigeon lung. And I think the most we can say is that it may be different parts, or what we call it antigen when you're having this type of allergic reaction. It might be a different antigen for some people. I think that there's pretty good evidence that there might be something in the droppings that causes this in some people. There might be something in the skin or the feathers that come off the birds that might be causing this reaction in some people. And there's also some evidence that substances that are in the blood of the pigeons or in the body fluids of the pigeons might also be contributing. So generally people will, because those things tend to accumulate in the cages, that might be a time when someone might be more susceptible to encountering those antigens because there'll be a higher concentration there.
That's interesting. So I've heard people say before too, because there's people who actually keep pigeons as pets. I have a pigeon as a pet in my house as well. And they'll say that, these pigeons, they create so much dander, that dander is a real problem. And, they'll even throw the word pigeon lung out there as, this is, you got to keep them bathed all the time. And I guess you could also say it kind of goes back to a loft. If you have a lot of pigeons with not good ventilation, that's just going to be a big old dusty mess. Are there other birds that have this sort of like thing? Like, is there like a parrot lung?
Yes. So pigeon lung is a subset of a larger group of diseases called bird fancier's lung. And bird fancier's lung is a subset of an overall disease state called hypersensitivity pneumonitis. So that hypersensitivity pneumonitis is what your lung doctor will call it when your lung is having this type of allergic reaction to something. So some people have it to mold. Some people will have it to, like farmers will have it to substances that they might breathe in their silo or in their barn. People who encounter and work with birds will have the same reaction occurring to the birds. So yes, there are people who have the same reaction happening from their parrot or from their cockatiel. One reason why we might hear more about pigeons is because more people have them as pets. But I don't think that it's known that one bird might be more likely to cause this situation than others.
However you have the setup, good ventilation, bad ventilation, Would you say that people are in a really dry environment? Like I live out in Arizona, very, very dry. Are we more susceptible to it because, it's more of a dust thing, or would it be the other side of it where people who have really humid environments, maybe it's more of a mold thing? Would you say that there's one side or the other be more susceptible to spreading it around?
I don't think that that could be said, and I think people living in those environments might, for various reasons, be more or less exposed. I don't know that there's any that I don't think that it's known that the climate itself could be causing one group to be more susceptible than others. But in hot environments, people might be more prone to be inside, and you might be around your pigeons more. Or in a humid environment, you might be more likely, as you said, to have mold developing in with the pigeon dander and other things, and that could also be exacerbating. So I think that there's equal possibility for both, and I'm sorry I can't give you a yes or no answer.
So if someone is thinking that they might have this, maybe they feel like every time I go into my loft, I start coughing and stuff like this, and they might be thinking that they might have pigeon lung. Is it a pretty easy thing to figure out? Like, is it a pretty quick test that they can get done and know for sure?
It's not as easy as going and getting your blood drawn, but it should be diagnosable fairly easily. I think the first thing that would need to happen is somebody would need to go talk to their doctor and let them know that they're having this symptom of feeling more short of breath and having the cough, and that they're concerned that it could be related to their pigeon. Depending on what type of doctor you have, you may need then to be sent to a pulmonologist, which is a lung doctor. The lung doctor will do a physical examination, will do some testing to see how well the lungs are working, and then may do a chest x-ray and may do a CAT scan. A CAT scan is kind of a three-dimensional picture of the inside of your lung. Depending on what the CAT scan shows, sometimes you can make the diagnosis just by looking at the CAT scan. Other times it might be necessary to do what's called a bronchoscopy. And a bronchoscopy, everyone always asks what that is. And the best way of saying it's kind of like a colonoscopy of the lung, where doctor will put a little camera down inside your lung, take some samples, and within probably about a week, you could get a diagnosis that your lung has this type of allergic reaction going on. But there's no specific way from looking at the lung to say that it's definitely from the pigeons. And so your doctor might do a blood test to see if it's probably related to the pigeons. But generally, what we say is when there's evidence of this type of lung situation, like this allergic reaction, and somebody has a pigeon, then you'll make the diagnosis that the patient has pigeon lung, and then you need to start, helping the patient deal with it.
So let's say somebody does find out that they do have pigeon lung and that it is something that the more they're around it, it's causing issues. What is it just going to be? That's it, no more pigeons for you, or what's some of the treatment options for healing on that?
Yeah, so the only known way to get the disease to go away in the early stage is to remove exposure to the antigen. The antigen, again, is the thing that you're breathing in that's making you sick. So the only way to truly rid your environment of the antigen is to get rid of the birds. But that's many patients find that difficult, and I can totally relate. I have a dog, and if I had to get rid of my dog because it was making me sick, I would really want to find a way to keep my dog and keep myself healthy. But the medical recommendation is always going to be to get rid of the birds. Now, for patients who want to keep the birds, there are certain things that people can try. And really keeping like cage cleaning, scrupulous cleaning, maybe having a different place where the birds are, so they're not with you all the time, wearing a mask when you're doing the cleaning, trying to limit the handling, that all of those things are proposed as being protective. The hope then is that if you're no longer breathing in these bird antigens, that if you're early enough in the disease, then the disease can subside and your lungs can go back to normal.
Is there any kind of medication that can just kind of calm down the irritation that's going on?
Yeah, so early in the disease, patients are often treated with what we call prednisone or glucocorticoids. This is a very, very strong medication in the steroid family. And depending on how severe the disease is, they might need the prednisone for a couple months. Typically, you might be treated for 1 to 2 months and then we taper it off. Prednisone, I don't know if you or your listeners have heard of it, but prednisone, it's a really, really wonderful drug that can substantially reduce inflammation and allergic responses. But prednisone has a lot of side effects. It can make diabetes get worse. It can make people gain weight. It can make your bones weak. So we try to keep the prednisone for as short a time as possible in order to try to get the lungs back to how they were before.
Let's say you get diagnosed and you do have pigeon lung, and let's say you get on some of this to help the condition of your lungs physically, and let's say you wear a mask and you limit exposure to pigeons. Would you ever be able to get back to a state where, hey, your lungs look good, kind of go back to normal, or would you always have to, from that point on, always have to take precautions?
That's a really good question. It probably depends on how entrenched the immune response was. If it was a relatively mild or early stage, you could probably go back to normal. But as your body becomes more and more strongly reactive to pigeons, it can be that you go into a room with pigeons and you might feel the disease coming back on. So you really, as the disease becomes more entrenched in you, you have to really start taking precautions.
What kind of steps can somebody take who, say they're in good health as is right now, and let's say just routinely cleaning out the loft, or would you even recommend wearing a mask during, handling or being in the loft at all times? What kind of steps can somebody take to just kind of prepare themselves or protect themselves from pigeon lung?
Patients ask a lot about things that they can do to limit their exposure to things that are in their home. And so, because as I said, pigeon lung is a smaller subset of a larger group of diseases where somebody's responding to something in your environment. So I think the advice for pigeons is similar to the advice that we give for any type of antigen where there's something in your home or in your work environment that's making you sick. So the first thing is always remove the antigen or minimize the antigen. But there are other things that you can do. So wearing a mask while you're interacting with your pigeon may make that interaction less meaningful, but it could also help protect your lungs. And if you're a person who's susceptible, you may want to consider mask wearing, and probably a good mask. I think over the last few years, people have become much more knowledgeable of the strength of the different types of masks. And so the N95s that people were wearing a couple of years ago, a mask with a really good fit, a mask that is able to filter out particles that could get through. That would be a type of mask that would help. I think the surgical masks that are very thin, that don't really have a good fit, I don't think that would be sufficient to keep these particles out of your lungs. Regular cleaning, keeping the cage clean. Obviously, when you're doing the cleaning, having protective mask, gloves, things like that, potentially doing all of that outside. Another thing that people will try is a HEPA filter or some type of filtration system in their home, or particularly in the room where the bird may be. Some people may choose to have a room where that's the only place that they interact with the bird. Again, I could see that might be difficult when you have a pet and you can only interact with them in one part of your home. But on the flip side, you want to be able to breathe, and you need to have your lungs for decades moving forward. So finding a balance between interacting with the bird and keeping your lungs healthy will be very important.
I see a lot of guys just throw a handkerchief up on their face. Is that really doing anything at all? Would you better off just not even doing the handkerchief?
I don't think I could say that one way or another, but the size of these particles are pretty small and they can probably make it through or around a handkerchief over their face. So putting a mask that doesn't work on might give a false sense of security and might inadvertently or might might ironically sort of make things worse because you think you're protected, so you're less careful. Whereas if you weren't wearing that mask or that handkerchief, you might use a little more caution.
Like you said, we've all become a little bit more aware about the different kinds of masks out there. So you recommend like the K95s, something that fits your face really well. Do you think it'd be like from a K95 to some of those respirator setups? Because I've also seen guys use those where they have the replaceable charcoal canisters on there.
Well, yeah, I mean, those are very, very good masks, and those you definitely know that you have the correct fit and you have the correct. I wish that we were on video because I'm doing a lot of hand gestures of like the different masks, how they go on your face. Did I understand you correctly that people wear those respirators when they interact with their birds?
Yeah, I've seen a couple guys wearing them when they're cleaning
Oh,
out their loft specifically, just because that really stirs up a lot of dust.
I think that is a very good approach. Those masks theoretically should have the same, that should be comparable to N95s, but the obviously those respirators, they're more durable. You get the better fit, the better seal. Also, you're not going through a mask every time that you use them. So those respirators would definitely be something that people should consider using.
Is there any other kind of advice that you would recommend for people when they are cleaning lofts or even just going in their lofts that say, would it be even worth doing if you're only in there for a few minutes? Like, let's say you're just checking feed or banding some babies or something like that. If you're in there for just a few minutes, would you say even then throw one on or?
Yes. Yes, I think that for two reasons. First of all, the the antigens get into your lung and they're not really able to be cleared by our immune system. And so even getting a little bit in over a period of time can get your immune system kind of primed and ready to respond. The other reason to wear the mask whenever you're doing the cleaning, and even if it's for a little short time, is just to get in the habit of prioritizing respiratory health when you're in there with the birds and just kind of make it a habit that every time you're going to do something, you put on the mask, even if it's just for a minute or two, because that way you'll have very good hygiene as it relates to your lungs, and you'll be doing your best to keep them healthy.
And one of the things, I mean, like what I try to do with the house pigeon that we have is I let her take regular baths. I feel like that helps just keep the dander down overall. Like some of the pigeons that they're not getting a lot of baths, like they definitely seem to just kind of put off more dust. Would you say that would kind of help, just kind of letting them bathe more to keep the dander down on their body?
I don't know enough about pigeons to be able to comment on how that would interact with the dander. But I do think that keeping the birds and the cage clean, just overall, will likely be helpful because even if it's not the dander, let's say it's something from the droppings, if the bird has droppings, or let's say it's from body fluids, if the bird has body fluids on, just washing those things off are likely to minimize the pigeon's ability to get you sick.
How common is pigeon lung? Is it a pretty common thing or is it sort of a rare thing?
It's pretty rare. It's rare. It's probably more common in the bird fancier community, but in the general population, it's quite rare. Actually, it's so rare that most of the time when people go to the doctor with it, the doctor might miss the diagnosis the first one or two visits because when patient comes in with shortness of breath and coughing, the first thing people always think of is asthma or COPD, which is I don't know if you know what that is, but it's kind of smoking related lung disease. So it's usually unless you go to the doctor specifically and are saying, "Oh, I'm worried that, I have a bird and I'm coughing, I'm worried it might be from the pigeon." Most of the time, the doctor will think of things that are common, which would be the asthma, the type family. And so it might take a little while before they think of it.
And you mentioned some of the different medications that are out right now to help heal the lungs from that. Is there anything like new coming up on the horizon to help treat pigeon lung, or is we pretty much got a solution that works already?
I wish we had more solutions that could permanently just make it go away and have people be able to have their pigeons, right? Because the drugs that we have right now, we have really two ways of treating pigeon lung with medications. The first is these steroid drugs I talked about. These are one of the oldest classes of drugs that we have, and it's how we've been treating this disease now for decades. Very recently, in the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a drug called nintedanib that has been approved to treat patients with advanced scarring in the lung from any reason, including pigeon lung. So this nintedanib drug, this is a drug for people with very, very severe pigeon lung where there's a lot of scarring. It doesn't make it get better. It doesn't reverse the disease. It just kind of prevents it from getting worse. So what we really need, and what I really hope somebody will be able to identify, is a way to fix the lung, suppress the immune system, and allow patients to continue to interact with their pets and love their birds, but we're not quite there yet.
And so if anybody wants to find out a little bit more and go in depth on learning more about the pigeon lung, is there any resources or websites that you could recommend to the listeners?
Yes, so I found a really great one. This was a website that I found that had a lot of really great information, and it was called enviroliteracy.org/how do you prevent bird fanciers' lungs? And it's really detailed.
I will share that link on our social medias too for people to check out when this episode comes out. We're coming up against the clock here, but I really want to thank you for coming on and talking with all of us pigeon guys and girls about pigeon lung and giving us some really good advice to kind of keep ourselves safe and what to do if something does come up. So thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you for asking me. I really hope you all learned something and that I helped you and that you're able to be with your birds in a safe way.
And that's going to wrap up this compilation episode. Like I said at the beginning, these are the conversations that don't always fit into just one part of the hobby, but they're a big part of what makes it so fun. From birds of prey, share and me, genetics to documentaries, and even the important stuff like pigeon lung, it really shows just how much there is to explore when it comes to pigeons. So if you've been enjoying the podcast and what we're doing here, please consider supporting it. The show is run through a nonprofit, so any donations are tax deductible, and it really does help everything that we have going on here. You can find out more information at pigeonpod.com. That's pigeonpod.com. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for your support, and see you at the next episode.